Hookfist. Representative Connolly. Representative Gray. Representative Greer.
Here.
Representative Summers. Vice Chairman Barlow. Chairman Dockstader.
Here. Okay, thank you. Let's proceed. Do we have any minutes that need to be approved? We good? All right. Let's proceed then with session calendar. Matt?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Matt Obrecht, LSO. We'll have Anthony, Sarah, and Don Richards walk council through 3 different options for the calendar for the 2023 general session.
Go ahead.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. So in front of you, you have 3 options, as Matt said. All of them pretty much contemplate an 8-week session. Basically follow a variety of calendars that you've done in the past, with the exception of 2020. With the exception of the 2021 general session, which was obviously an anomaly because of COVID. Mr. Richards is here to walk you through anything you have questions on regarding the budget process. I don't know if, I'm sure you've all had a chance to look at this. I can go through each one of these briefly if you'd like. Option A is a 37-day schedule with a Martin Luther King 3-day weekend and a President's Day 3-day weekend, which follows what you did in 2019 with an adjournment of Friday, March 3rd. Option B is a 37-day schedule with just a President's Day recess, also an 8-week schedule, adjourning on Thursday, March 2nd. And then option C is a 38-day schedule with the President's Day recess in February, also adjourning March 3rd, which is a Friday. And then obviously that gives you a handful of days if necessary for the 2024 budget session.
Okay, questions, committee? On the Zoom? All right. Remind me what we did with our last one here. I'm trying to recall a President's Day situation.
So like I said, in 2021, so you did convene on President's Day last year during the budget session, but typically in the past you have taken a President's Day recess during a general session, and then like I mentioned in 2019, you actually did do a Martin Luther King Day holiday and a President's Day holiday.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Is this a good time for just general comments on all these schedules? Or?
I think we're open to that. Go ahead.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, my concern is the JAC schedule. We went through quite a process, I thought, to try to be able to move those timelines up so we wouldn't be, the second week in session before we actually had a budget bill, or actually longer than that, because it'll take a while after a 20th of January final markup. And so I would like us to contemplate backing that up a week. For example, there's only 1 week in December right now for budget hearings. I don't know why we can't have this pretty well cranked out. If we need to do the round robin after Craig, in January, we can do that. But I just think, I think it's problematic for a lot of reasons. I remember, when I first came in, it was a schedule similar to this, I thought. And really the key people that are on appropriations were off the floor for much of the discussion of many of the bills. And I just don't like that. And so I'd like Don to kind of think about what some options are that works obviously for your staff, or the Appropriations Committee, where we could back up a week on that.
Okay, before we go back to Don, Ms. Vice President, you're on appropriations. You want to weigh in on this?
Leader Summer said, I think very important.
Yeah, we got to have you on the mic.
Yeah, I guess I would concur with Representative Summers.
Thank you, Don.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Don Richards, Budget and Fiscal Administrator. You are right, you have to reach back to 2019 for a comparable because the COVID general session was unusual to say the least. However, from a budget standpoint, it actually worked out quite well. You'll recall we had a short session where they marked up the budget, and then that budget was on the desks of legislators. It turns out to be a month before their long session. Now, I recognize that was an unusual occurrence. We did make an adjustment in these three options, but perhaps we went the wrong way. So in particular, let's just look at option A. Under our historic practice, we would have budget week beginning January 30th, and we added a week to that. And the purpose of that was not to give us more time to write the budget, but was to give more time for the public, state agencies, lobbyists, and the press to have an opportunity to view the bill before it was discussed on the floor. Under our traditional practice, we would actually print the bill on Sunday, January 29th, and committee of the whole would begin on the following Monday. Almost no opportunity to digest that information. So we actually added a week for that purpose of public transparency. A couple of additional comments. Representative Summers, Majority Leader Summers is correct. We only have 1 week. Currently, we're anticipating about 24 agencies for hearings in December. We will easily come up with a schedule that provides for all of those agencies to have a good hearing. Craig is currently anticipating meeting on Wednesday, January 4th. That's not on the calendars here, but it just kind of gives you a sense. We are prepared to provide the report. It takes us about a week, maybe a little more than a week to write a Craig report. And you can see on January 13th, under all scenarios, we are providing that report. And then the governor historically has had an opportunity to adjust his recommendations through the form of governor's letters immediately after Craig, and then have a JAC markup. That's not to say all of this couldn't be done in December, and then as Majority Floor Leader Summers indicated, have, say, a round robin or something like that, which honestly would be much less of a turnaround for us to provide a bill probably quicker, probably a week quicker, and still provide for a few days or several days for public review of that budget, if that's the preference of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don, what would be the downside to that scenario of doing the work in December and then just maybe having 1 day of round robin or 2 days of round robin after the Craig and then release the budget? Why aren't we structured that way?
Mr. Chairman, that would be a change in practice, and it really is not, it's a policy choice for the legislature. Historically, the old committee, meaning the existing members, have not marked up the budget. The new committee has. Now, that is in contrast with every other bill, because every other committee bill is marked up by the quote-unquote old committee, or the committee of the 66th rather than the 67th legislature. One difference between those two, however, is all of those bills have an opportunity to be heard by the new standing committee. And the budget bill does not get referred back to the JAC, so those committee members would not necessarily have a individual opportunity to look at the bill, but of course, it would be open for floor debate.
I was going to follow up with you anyway. Representative Summers, what does your proposal do when it goes to the public on the 1st? What are we doing with the public in your proposal?
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I guess I'm asking kind of Don for the timelines on that. All I'm suggesting is we can do things more quickly. And so my question back to Don was, then could we have the Craig report to JAC like on the 12th? If you're going to have it the 4th and you take a week to to write the Craig report, can that Craig report? And then that would allow basically the round robin on the 13th, or you could even have the rest of the 12th and the 13th for the round robin if you needed that much time.
Don?
Mr. Chairman, I think that is a distinct possibility. As you know, the January Craig is a much smaller report than the October Craig. It's, we try to just have minor updates and revisions. So I think the 12th is a possibility. And then the 11th, you could not, the JAC could choose not to meet at all, or if they did have some callbacks, they could address those on that day.
Go ahead, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and I think I also agree with trying to get as much to what Senator Hicks and Representative Summers are both, well, I guess everybody on here is an ex-appropriator except myself, trying to get more work done in December, if at all possible. The one thing that I want to make comment on is when last day of committee of the whole first house is on, and I always believe it's better to have it on a Friday than on a Monday. And so the fundamental question there is, you know, shortening it up one day. So then this scenario, it's last day of committee of the whole first house is on a Monday, and then you begin budget committee of the whole too. So that, I'm not saying that it's impossible, I'm just saying that last day of committee of the whole first house can be long days. So I would like those two to be separated, and that last day of committee of the whole be on a Friday so that we know where we are. It's a kind of a monumental cutoff in at least my life in the legislature. And so, and the other two calendars have that. I think the fundamental question is, are we taking both holidays or just one? And that's the fundamental question in this. And I'm not suggesting right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the fundamental question about this shifting of the date and that committee of the whole date. Or do we want to change, you know, just have less time in that first house and move that committee of the whole that committee of the whole first house up a day? Thank you.
Don, address the Friday part of that comment, and then committee weigh in after that on what you want done with the holidays. Go ahead, Don, or whoever.
Mr. Chairman, I'll probably defer to Anthony, but one of the reasons why we provide the budget overlay on top of the last day for committee of the whole, second reading, third reading, is to avoid those type of double conflicts, if you will. You don't, ideally, you don't want to have last day for third reading also be, or last day of the committee of the whole also be last day on the budget. So that's really, I think, the primary purpose. The other reason we overlay this is to ensure that we have sufficient time to get the budget to the governor and have 3 days for his potential veto overrides. To the first question, and you can see this in option B, the 37-day with the MLK and President's Day recess. We also potentially have some ability to move the budget and also complete it within 1 week. Likely this supplemental budget will not be like the last 2 or 3 that you've had, meaning we don't have across the board 15% reduction that I'm aware of. We don't have a reorganization of ETS, meaning we have a subset of agencies coming forward. So one option is to have budget committee of the whole be limited to 1 day rather than split over 2 days. Another option is to, you're exactly right, Speaker Barlow, to move that last day for committee of the whole one direction or the other. And one last comment between options A, B, and C, and that is on option B, really the only difference there is the budget needs to be wrapped up when you only take 1 day of vacation, President's Day. The budget actually has to be wrapped up on Friday, the 24th. On the other 2 scenarios, the budget needs to be wrapped up on Friday, February 27th in order to provide for a 3-day respite prior to override.
Okay. Committee thoughts on the holidays, or did you have something for it? Any holiday thoughts? Okay, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. So on the 37, 38, et cetera. Sunday does not count as a day. So let's say we had to go to 40 days or for whatever reason. Remind me what Sundays do, because on one of these calendars, we're running on the 2nd. Well, adding 3 more days to that puts us on a Sunday. That means we have to actually roll to Monday. Is that accurate, Director?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, that is accurate. You cannot meet on Sundays per the
thank you.
Constitution.
Go ahead, Albert.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So Don, you know, and I'm really looking for guidance here. So if we did a thing where Craig was on the 12th, round robin, 12th and the rest of the 13th, then would you be able to, would it be best to shift the budget week up a week? And that way we don't conflict with the last week of, you know, committee of the whole second read. You know, we're not gonna have to twist ourselves into a pretzel. You know, a lot of times what you can do is you can in the House is just fast forward from second to third on some and to manage that schedule. But if we do it this way, we're not gonna conflict with the last day committee of the whole, last day of second, last day of third. Is that good? Would that work?
John?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, you're correct. If we do not meet for JAC the week of the 16th, I would recommend that the budget be moved to the week of January 30th, and that avoids, let me double check here. You do end up having some consideration potentially on that Friday the 3rd, because in, for instance, option A, that would be third reading on the budget and last day for committee of the whole. So you may want to do the budget Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday rather than Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Just an option there, just to avoid that conflict on Friday the 3rd. Last day for the committee of the whole and last day on the budget makes for an excessive.
Okay. Make sure, Representative Greer, we miss anything out there for you? Are you good?
Mr. President, I think the last day on the budget clearly has to be separated from last day of committee of the whole. Last day, as the speaker said, last day for the budget on a Friday makes perfect sense, seems to work well. I would lean more towards last day of committee of the whole being on Monday. And then I also concur with with Representative Summers and Senator Hicks, move JAC up so that they're not off the floor the whole first week. And that helps get the budget out to the public and the members quicker. So those are my general comments. I do believe that having one day of recess, typically that's the one in February, works very well for members to be able to go back, tend to matters back home. Having the one in January typically doesn't provide that much benefit.
Thank you. Those in the room haven't spoke. Representative Connolly, Representative Gray, anybody here that would like to weigh in on this? Go ahead, Representative.
I concur with virtually everything. Moving JCC into December makes a whole lot of sense to me. That it actually concerns me to think that there would be the new members of JCC doing the supplemental hearings before markup. I remember that when I was on Appropriates on our side, I could sit with the committee in November or in December, and that made sense to me, but I wasn't responsible for that final kind of questioning of agency. So I do like the idea of moving it back up again. My thought about the holidays is I'd like us to celebrate Equality Day and Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, even though it's kind of an inconvenient time that we've only been in session for a week.
Okay. All right. Well, we're starting to get some head shakes. Senator?
Mr. President,
Yeah. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
I would concur with everything that Representative Greer said. I think that makes the most sense to me, and I think it is absolutely the most workable scenario. And that's what I would propose that we
Is the
adopt.
motion then?
Yeah, I would make the motion that we adopt the calendar suggested by Representative Greer.
Is there a second? Second. Moved and seconded. Further discussion? Go ahead. Let's go to Representative Summers and then to the speaker.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think we ought to, before we do a final vote, just see if we could get that looked at, you know, get it kind of tweaked up and have it in front of us so we know what we're approving or not approving. But would that be possible to get that done before we do it?
Mr. Speaker, was that what you were pursuing as well?
Mr. President, yeah, I guess I'd like to just hold the motion until we actually see a calendar copy, so we make sure we don't have something just something doesn't pop up, because I don't want to really revisit this
Yeah.
when we get an email later saying, hey,
Okay,
didn't
so
work.
we could-
So, Mr. Chairman, I think the motion would be to direct staff to adopt that calendar and then present that back to Management Council for final approval.
Right, and do we want to do that in the timeframe of today or a later date?
What I would ask, Mr. President, I'd ask staff is what's a reasonable time frame to get that turned around and back to us for a look? Is that possible today?
Yep.
Or this week?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let's take that up first thing after lunch.
Okay.
We'll get it drafted and yeah, we'll present it to you right after lunch today.
Fair enough then. Somebody
So,
just lost
Mr. Chairman, I
the
don't know if
chair.
that even requires a motion.
It's just on the hold on the table. Senator Rothfuss, we kind of walked on you. You were getting ready to say something.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So, looking at, I was contemplating the calendars, and Calendar A actually has some of the dates better aligned, where you have the last day of Committee of the Whole would be on the 6th, which is the Monday. If we moved up the budget to the prior week, then you end up solving the problem that was discussed. I think that's an appropriate approach. And honestly, then, from my view, I would support the rest of Calendar A with the budget moved up as my preference. I do think multiple Mondays off during the session are beneficial in general, particularly in this general session, just as a way of ensuring that people have some the energy to get through things, to have the long weekend. I wish it were a week later. I don't think we can reschedule that, though. I don't think anyone gives us that authority, but sure would be handy if it were the 23rd. But I just wanted to weigh in favor of basically Calendar A with a week earlier budget, consistent with what Representative Summers was suggesting for the timeline.
Do we want any follow-up? Okay, so folks, at this point, committee, we have a motion on the table. It's seconded. Absent objection, we're going to see a final copy of it right after lunch. So go ahead, Representative Gray.
I would just like, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think Representative Greer, Chairman Greer had sort of about a 2.5-minute long comment. So what are the pieces to the motion? I mean, I think there were 3 or 4 things, 3 or 4 bullet points in that motion. Can we review that?
Mr. Chairman, let's see what staff has and make sure that that's consistent with the motion and with what Representative Greer stated as far as the JAC hearings, the last day of the budget and committee of the whole, and then the number of days, and with the one, I believe it was one day, we'd have only the one-day recess on that Monday.
Who was the great note taker with all of this?
All right,
Okay.
could you restate that?
Mr. Chairman, there's one, I will restate it, and I think there is one difference. Taking Representative Greer's proposal, we would move back the budget week 1 week. And I believe his motion was to use option A, the 37-day option B, the 37-day with just President's Day recess, not the MLK Day recess, which is a little different than what Senator Rothfuss had proposed, which was essentially option A with everything else the same as Representative Greer described.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator, do you want to follow up on that, or Representative Connolly?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd just say that we could, I mean, that's the baseline decision is do we want 2 or 1? We can make that by motion right now, up or down. And then everything else falls into place based on which one of those 2 we go with. So I'll just make a motion for A as being the base calendar, subject to the revision we discussed. So if there's a second on using A as the base calendar.
Motion to amend, is there a second? Second. Motion to amend. Any further discussion, Mr. Speaker?
So, thank you, Mr. President. So, while I understand that the 16th is an official holiday, if we work that holiday, we want to take the 23rd or the 30th as a more timely 3-day weekend, we could do that too. I'm not amending your amendment to the motion. I'm just saying that I mean, if we think a 3-day weekend does make sense or another one, and we want it somewhere else.
Senator?
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
From the standpoint of celebrating MLK Day, the 16th is when we should do it. From the standpoint of when the legislators would like to have a day off, I'm going to guess the 23rd is the right choice. So I'm open to either.
Strong Feelings Committee? Okay. Guess we got a motion, we got a second. Is it friendly to the original? We're good?
Well, I guess honestly, just if we can sense the preference of the committee, 23rd or 16th on that, and then have a final vote.
Okay, but let's vote on the amendment then. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Yeah.
Repeat, please, for Mr. Vice President.
All right.
We'll start with including 2 holidays, and then we'll go back, if that motion passes, and figure out which day the holiday should be on for a second holiday. How's that?
Everyone,
Yeah,
everyone clear?
all right.
All right. Senator?
Well, go ahead, Representative, let's figure this out. This matters a lot to the, I think, the Senate. If Representative Summers had a preference between 16th and 23rd or anything along those lines, I'd
Go ahead,
want to hear it.
Representative.
Mr. Chairman, if we're going to have a second day off, I think either the 23rd or the 30th is the place to have it. But I think you need to make, whatever motion you're going to make the date, make the motion, and if it fails, we still have an opportunity after lunch if we want to change that one.
All right, well, the motion is the baseline, use calendar A.
Okay, that's the motion.
Mr. Chairman, there is one consideration between the 23rd and the 30th. If you do the 30th, you'll push the budget bill third reading to last day for committee of the whole under the current calendar scenario.
And Mr. Chairman, I think the alternative would be the 23rd if we don't go with the 16th, but there's a desire to have a second holiday, the 23rd would be the sweet spot, so.
Leaning into the 23rd, and that's what your amendment is?
My amendment is currently just calendar A as
Okay,
presented.
All right, we'll go with that motion on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Ooh, show of hands. 2, 3. Those opposed? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That amendment has failed. Go ahead.
Same motion with the 23rd as the second holiday.
Okay, you've heard it. All those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, nay. Show me your hands. All those in favor, say aye. 3, those opposed? Oh, okay, we got a majority. Sorry about you, Senator Greer. Holler at us.
Mr. President,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
we can.
Yeah, I would just maybe use the term recess instead of holiday. Citizen legislators do need to go back, take care of their citizens, their constituents, their business, their family. So I wouldn't use the term holiday for those 2 days, but rather recess, take the politics out of it.
Okay. Note that for the calendar adjustments, we're calling it a recess. All right, at this point. We did. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So at this point, we're coming back after lunch, and we'll see the final product. Go ahead, Vice President.
Adding 23rd is another day that we would be in recess. Did that pass or not?
Last two motions failed.
Okay.
The last two motions failed. No, the 23rd passed. The original 23rd passed, okay. Thank you for the clarification. All righty. Good?
Yeah, I'll probably just reiterate for everyone, Mr. Chairman, but we're gonna draft a new calendar for your consideration right after lunch. It is a 37-day session calendar with 2 recesses, January 23rd and also February 20th. We will move the budget week to starting January 30th,
Okay.
and then adjust accordingly from there.
All right, thank you. We'll look forward to the product right after lunch. Thank you for someone giving up their lunch break.
And Mr. Chairman, maybe at this point, I just need to mention to council, we still have some plumbing work being done outside. So they've got a generator running. It's very hard for people online to hear. So if you could pull your mic.
Closer.
We've got the room mics turned up as high as they can. So if you could
Appreciate it. Yeah, it
speak
is
into your microphone.
kind of a difficult hum even here in the room. Okay. All right. That having been said, we'll go to subcommittee reports. We got, Senator Landon is out on the field. I think I just got a text from him. He's on a state park tour. I mean, he'll be here for wayfinding later, so Representative Summers, you want to take this with Matt? This is on Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedures.
Let me,
We got Mr. Gruber back.
so, Mr. Chairman?
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so the subcommittee met twice, I believe, isn't that right? And we had some really good discussions and debates. Most of the stuff we didn't change from staff changes, which was just to update our current practices into the manual. There are a couple, 3 key decision points, I'd say, along the way. And rather than fumble through them, I'm going to defer to the good hands of Mr. Groover to basically lay it out and talk about what we did and what we didn't do and why we did it.
Mr. Gruber.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to take this in any way you want to. We can do just the 30,000-foot level. My plan would be to do that with zooming in on those 3 or 4 important points.
Good plan.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. All right. Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Director reminds me I should start with a little background on how we got here and why you're here. And so you should
We
have
just
2
assume
documents.
everybody knows why. Okay, go ahead.
You should have 2 documents in front of you, Mr. Chairman. One says background on it. It's an 8-pager. And then you should have the draft 10/13/2022. And that has all the changes. And I'll admit this is probably more changes than I've ever seen in the manual. Part of that is because the manual is to be updated every 4 years, and that hasn't been done lately, Mr. Chairman. Lots of reasons for that. And in fact, one of the changes in the manual that's recommended is instead of having a set every 4 years update, it'll be updated periodically as Management Council suggests to the Rules Committee. And it should be noted that the manual, like rules, have to be voted on by each house. And where the manual follows in precedential value is Constitution, and then the rules of each body, and then the manual. The manual, really what it does is fill in blanks in the rules and adds interpretations and things like that. So it's very important as far as your precedential value. Now, where the manual falls as far as value between between the statutes varies a little bit between the Senate and the House. The Senate places it below statute. The House actually places it above statute. So there's that little difference. Other than that, the manual is generally below Constitution, below rules, above precedent, and above Masons.
Okay, go ahead, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, and just one other note that I think is important, and I think Mr. Groover's not going to say it, but we want to get some of this institutional knowledge in the document before we lose the institutional knowledge, you know, and I think Mr. Groover and Mr. Obrecht, Director Obrecht, are part of that, and so we want to just make sure we get that down.
Thank you. Mr. Kruger?
Yep. Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on that, if you look at page 1 of the background, it talks about what the manual does and what the changes do. And Representative Summers is 100% right. A lot of these changes, when I say you have more than you've ever had, what we've done is try to put a lot of precedent into the manual. It's just because as you lose, people age out, like me, you lose some of that historic knowledge. And this puts it in, and it actually upgrades it a little bit because now it's above precedent. It's something that's in writing that the bodies have adopted. And so it's like, here's how you've done it for the last 40 years. And so everybody knows that, and you agree basically by adopting these changes to the manual that, yes, we're going to continue doing it that way. And when we get to one of the highlights, Mr. Chairman, it's, well, how do you change the manual? And the subcommittee actually took affirmative action on that.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
a question, Dave, and you just went through that hierarchical procedure of constitution, statutes, manuals, rules. Where is that at? Is that outlined within the manual, and particularly the differences between the way the House and the Senate place it in that hierarchical model of what has precedent?
Mr. Chairman, you'll find it in your rules and you'll find it in Masons, both. But your rules control over Masons, and the Masons actually puts that hierarchy together. And if you have a difference between Masons and your rules, the rules of course control. But you'll find it in your House and Senate rules. The Senate is more explicit. The House kind of defers to Masons, but by deferring to Masons, again, what Masons does is put it basically in the same place as the
Okay,
Senate
so
does.
you told me where it's at. How do I find where it's at? In other words, is there something in this manual that's going to say, this is the process for the House, this is the process for the Senate? Constitution, statutes, manual, rules. Where is that outlined? Or do I have to go to the rules and then I have to go to Masons? And that's what I'm trying to understand is there something that provides that roadmap very clearly?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, in the Senate, you'd go to the rules. In the House, you'd go to the rule, and then the rule will send you to Masons. And so you have two different places depending on which body you're dealing with.
Good, Mr. Vice President?
Yeah, I think that's fine, other than it would be really nice to have at least a schematic of that process. So when there is a difference that we can go right to that. Yeah,
Mr.
and just,
Speaker.
so you go right there so we understand instead of having these discussions amongst the chambers, it's just laid out right in the manual.
Mr. Speaker.
And I, thank you, Mr. President. I concur completely, and I think maybe it's just part of this manual. One of the first pages is lay it out, the House side, the Senate side, and we know everybody has a quick reference for what that is. I mean, we know it's always the Constitution at the top. We know it's rules next, but after that, if there's differences, let's just lay it out in this manual as a table or flow chart or whatever you want. I think it's a good idea, actually. And we can also reference the particular Senate rule or House rule that where that change takes place. Even though I know it's in the script or the text, I think maybe we're just visual people today. It's Monday.
Mr. Gruber, Matt, how complicated is all that?
Mr. Chairman, it's not complicated. In fact, what I think you could do is take what's on the background where it spells that out and just put that as an appendix to the manual. And that'll be a quick, easy reference. here's where you go for this, if you're in the Senate, here's where you go if you're in the House.
Go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, kind of in our part one, which is kind of that broad overview, you could actually refer to that appendix, like have a subsection 4, refer to the appendix for procedural orders.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a note of that, and,
Okay.
and that's what we'll put, and we'll jump into part one. If you look at your draft on page 1, part 1, this was added by the subcommittee, and there was a little bit of concern where we're recommending put this precedent in, put this practice in. Well, should we be bound by a 2/3 vote and that kind of thing? And what that part 1 does is the subcommittee's recommendation is that if a provision of the manual needs to be changed or overruled, suspended by a body, that takes a majority vote, not a 2/3 vote like a rule, by the elected members. If a ruling based on precedent from the manual is made by a presiding officer, that can be overruled by, I have no idea what that is, but that can be overruled by a majority vote of the folks present when the ruling is made. And neither one affects the 2/3 vote for suspending a rule.
And Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is a key point, right? This is maybe the key point of the document is what priority, is the manual given? And in the end, the committee felt like it was really just a majority vote, that it shouldn't be a supermajority, if only supermajority for rules.
All right, go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, one of the concerns there was the meticulous scrutiny that goes into drafting the rules, because they have to be right, and you need 2/3 to override them during session. So we debate those ad nauseum, and we should. This Manual of Legislative Procedures has a lot of things in it that aren't necessarily going to receive that same level of scrutiny. And so I know I felt a lot more comfortable if a simple majority of the body could go against it without having to rewrite it or suspend it. Effectively, it's the way things are right up until the body wants them to go differently at any given moment, and they can go differently. So it's a different tier rules, and then the legislative procedure manual. So at that point, hopefully people are a little bit more comfortable with the level of detail and the changes that are going into this, to the extent that if the chamber just finds that on any given day that it doesn't like the way that it's written in the Manual of Legislative Procedures, if that's the only source of a given rule, if it's not actually explicit in the rules, then a majority of those present can move against it temporarily.
Thank you. Any follow-up to that? Back to you, Mr. Gruber.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the first one I'd point out, and this is not a great key point, but it's one that comes up quite a bit, and that's on page 1, the co-sponsor approval limits. And I just point out that that's been looked at least twice over the last 20 years, and you've actually had your select committees and a subcommittee look at it, and you've stayed with the 15 co-sponsor limit, and that was for mailing postcards, and you stay with the same for your extranet. That does not mean you can only have 15 co-sponsors. That's just the number that will be sent out. And just a bit of background, the reason really that came about was because folks figured out, well, if I can get 31 people in the House to co-sponsor my bill, it's already done. And leadership at the time and the select committees looked at it and said, you know, if you do that, you're really end running the process. And so can you do it? Yeah. But are you going to do it as a matter of course, as a matter of practice? We're going to try to make that no, and so that we have a fair debate on bills.
So, Mr. Chairman, a question on that. Dave, in running the process, so what exactly are we talking about here, just because you got 31 co-sponsors of end running the process? It's not like the bill doesn't get introduced, go to committee, go through first, second, and third reading. So how are we end running the process?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I can just speak for myself on it and my thought process. And that is, if you've already got 31 sponsors on the internet, it's assumed that it'll pass, or 32 now, you know. And so it makes it gives the appearance that the bill's passed before it's been heard by the public. And I know in our subcommittee, we talked about this, and we went with the 50. This was another conscious decision we made. This wasn't just a revision. This was a conscious decision.
Follow up to that, Dave? Let me just ask real quick, and then we're going to go to you. Do you need to double check on any of those? You good? Okay. Representative Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I was going to talk about this a little later, but since we're running through, I do want to make a comment here. You know, I think this is something that I brought motions on the committee, and frankly, it was probably one of the top 3 things when I ran in the body both times that I talked about with the membership. I just don't think the 15 limit makes sense in the year 2022 or 2023 soon. I think that this was a relic sort of when these were sent out. And I think the idea that having 31 co-sponsors means that all 31 is going to vote for it. I mean, I could count many, many times when a co-sponsor has not voted on a bill on the floor. And yes, it does yield frustration from the bill sponsors, but it happens routinely. And I just think that, you know, I've had a couple bills where I've gotten many co-sponsors, and there was one that was, I believe, a landmark change that I think that work that people put in to get those co-sponsors brought it momentum. And I think that's part of being a good legislator and getting a bill across the finish line. And so anyway, I'm pretty passionate on this one, and probably might bring an amendment later, but we'll see. But you know, it has been voted on by the committee, even in this sitting. So, but I did want to make some comments on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker, do you? Oh, Representative Greer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. You know, I'm somewhat ambivalent by this. I understand the reason we had the 15 limit when we were doing green cards. In today's world where it goes out and it's electronic, to accept it, the amount of work for staff isn't there. The one thing I do like about the 15, and maybe this is just me, is it does help my workload when I'm receiving co-sponsor requests. Someone has to think and make a decision whether to send me one. And so it's a little different perspective. I'm not persuaded that it shortcuts the process. And give my opportunity here to poke at Representative Summers, because I don't think you can assume someone is going to vote for it just because they've co-sponsored. And I would look at it more from the limitation as more of a workload management standpoint. It being a legislator that would not co-sponsor until I completely read, understood, and probably talked to the sponsor. But in terms of workload, what's it matter if there's 31 names on the bill, 40 names on the bill as it goes out? So just my comments on it.
Thank you. Any further follow-up? Go ahead, Mr.
Mr.
Speaker.
Chairman, maybe just a quick follow-up from me. The other consideration is getting bills posted. Is if you leave it open-ended on how many co-sponsors you have, then people are less likely to get their bill numbered. And that just provides for less notice. That's the one other consideration on limiting co-sponsors.
Let's double check. We had the speaker hold up for just a moment. Go ahead.
I didn't hear exactly what you said. It does something, and I didn't hear what that something was.
Yeah. You bet. Mr. Chairman, if you don't cap the number of co-sponsors, it will, people won't number their bills as soon. They'll leave them open in a draft form longer to try to get more co-sponsors as long as they can. And then that provides less notice to the public for us to be able to finalize those and put them on the website.
Thank you. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. So on that point, maybe if we take the limit off, maybe we give them a time limit, 5 days from when you send out your initial co-sponsor request till it's cut off. What's on the bill is on the bill. They can still go get the written signatures on the bill jacket later. I mean, that's one, to limit that. The second part, and I agree with you, those late, as a presiding officer, they got 87 bills on the last day. That's a problem. It's very challenging. So to that issue. But I think I want to just take a step back here is what do we expect to get out of this discussion today? We're going to go through each one of these provisions. I hope not. But if we stop at every one of them, we're going to be here all morning with Mr. Groover. And I don't know that we want to go into that detail. I think we get through the high fly. This is going to be adopted by the next legislature. What we're doing is forwarding a proposed revisions. It's up to them to look at it and adopt it at some point. So I don't know, Mr. President, if you and the director have talked about this, but I guess I want to understand it. We're going to try to go through this and have a final document that we say, we're going to adopt this and we're going to recommend it. Or we're going to say, these are the adjustments we want to make and forward them on. What are we trying to get done? Because this is going to be a long day if we keep at this pace.
See that as a request to go back up to 30,000 feet, Mr. Brewer?
Well, anyway, I just want to be clear about what we want to try to accomplish with this discussion and the good work that was done, and I appreciate it, but what is this council going to do that a different council in 60 days is going to take up again? So, thank you.
Mr. Senator, and then absent objection, we're going to go back up to that high fly.
Well, on that point, the subcommittee wasn't trying to write policy anywhere we could avoid writing policy. We were trying to codify how are things done now. That was the task we had. This document is that. We didn't spend a lot of time, in fact, we avoided spending any time because we all had other things to do, debating these types of issues. On this one, we have a policy. This is the policy. We made sure that the writing on the piece of paper reflected what we thought was the policy. So we could debate all of these issues, but that did not seem like the task at hand, and it does seem like it would be a tenfold greater burden if we were trying to, at the same time, develop policy rather than just write on a piece of paper what we think the policy currently is for the Manual of Legislative Procedures. So I would go along with the idea of let's just try and stick with that theme of, does this properly reflect the way that we're doing things now? And we can always bring rule changes and changes to it separately.
Absent objection, take us back up. Mr. Brewer.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, and following up on the senator's point, that is from the legislative handbook. And all we're doing here is putting it in the manual so that it's clear, going to Senator Hicks's point, people can see it now. You don't have to look in 5 different places to find it. That's where it comes from. And all those policy reasons that you talked about, I've heard them at least 3 times now. And I probably shouldn't have shortcut by saying, here's the main one, because every one of those I've heard, and it's a policy debate for you. But again, it just reflects what you're doing now, putting it in the manual. Mr. Chairman, on page 2, and this is just, again, it's what you're doing now, but we put it here so it's real clear to folks. If you have these task force committees with non-legislators on them, they cannot sponsor legislation. That would be an unlawful delegation.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, are you going to follow the kind of that abbreviated? Are we going like through the manual, or are you going to use that? Which document are you kind of rolling through? So
Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of rolling through both, and actually based on that last one, I'm going to roll through a lot faster and just hit the really high points. And I guess I'd say, Mr. Chairman, if you want anything you want to slow down in the manual, the changes, or the explanation slow me down if I skip over them. I mean, I know you can all read and,
Thank you. Let's go
and
ahead.
you have limited time.
One other?
Question at this point, but I am curious about that third paragraph on page 2, where it says that bills may be pre-filed only by an incumbent legislator who will be a member of the next session of the legislature. So that confuses me a bit because of elections, honestly, just to start with, that how do you know that members of the House will be members of the next session? And it also says that a lame duck really can't pre-file either. So I'm curious about the addition of that clause. That does seem to be a departure from what we do right now.
Mr. Chairman, it's not, and in fact, going in Senator Hicks's point, what that really is putting in the manual what you have in statute. And the statute only talks about pre-filing by members who will be in the next legislature. And we don't pre-file bills, don't number bills until after the election. And so you do know who's coming back and who's not. And you're right, Representative, a lame duck could not pre-file a bill. You have to find another legislator to pick that up. And that issue has come up before, and the advice is you need to find somebody who's going to be a member. Now, again, that's different than somebody who's a member files something and then resigns or whatever. Once it's filed and it's with the chief clerk, then it belongs to the bodies. But before that, all we're doing here is following, if you look at the explanation on page 2B, 288105B, all we're doing is putting that statute into the manual.
Go ahead.
So for clarity on that, I guess pre-filed seems like it's broader than perhaps what I was interpreting it as also. Pre-filed basically means it's going to be published on the website as a pending piece of legislation that's gone through the process. It doesn't mean drafted or anything along those lines. It is that final stage of being published. Is that right?
Go ahead, Dave.
100%, Mr. Chairman. And we draft for anybody up until the time you're no longer a legislator. If you call up on December 31st or whatever and say, I want this bill drafted so I can give it to whoever's taking my place, we draft that for you.
Mr. Chairman, on that one, should we have in here, and I don't know if we do, I don't remember it, express permission for newly elected but not sworn in legislators? We do give them the authority to have bill drafts drafted. Do we have that in here? Is that expressed? Because they're not legislators.
Says the legislators elect on line 2 of the
Go ahead though here, Mr. Gruber. Or do you want to jump in?
It's in there, Mr. Chairman. It says
That's the pre-filed.
a legislator elect.
Mr. Gruber can clear it up right now.
Mr. Chairman, I would point the legislator-elect can have it pre-filed. You can only get pre-filed. There's other provisions that might not be in the manual that say that LSO will draft for legislators, and only, in fact, LSO can draft for legislators to file. They have to be drafted and gone through LSO, and I can't point to you where it is exactly. That Matt tells me it's statutory, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
So be it.
Not something we need though in here. All right, thank you.
Fair enough. Take it back up high. Set the points.
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to winnow through here this things that are really important. On page 4, Mr. Chairman, it's a little bit of a clarification of the rules. And so you have different actions that can be taken, and we start actually on page 3. You can have a positive recommendation, you can have no recommendation, you can have a negative recommendation. And what this provision does is try to clarify in the rules, when do those bills get reported out of committee? And there's a little bit of a gap in the rules, Mr. Chairman, and the manual kind of points out that, let's say you have a do pass motion that fails, and no one wants to make a motion to do not pass. And so where does that stay? And this manual puts that in to say that follows with those that you take no action on. And so they don't come out until after the last day for consideration, Mr. Chairman.
Continue. Go ahead.
Mr. Groover, there's been a number of times where bills have been assigned to a appropriations committee, and the recommendation on a substantive, this was not for re-referral, but on a substantive decision, even when it was a do not pass recommendation, it still was on the committee of the whole list. And I've never really understood what was going on there. So is that it codified in here, or is that just some kind of practice? This was not on a re-referral, I want to be clear. It just happened this year, actually, as well on a bill. Thank you.
Mr. Gruber?
Mr. Chairman, it is codified in here in two different places, Representative. And what you have in the House and Senate differ a little bit, but I'll just go generally with what you have. The House is all your positive recommendations are considered first. And then, so your do pass amendments are considered first by House rule. All your negative recommendations, where you actually have an affirmative motion, do not pass, are considered after all the positive bills are considered. When those that have a negative recommendation but have a motion that passed, the rules really don't say when they're going to be reported out of committee. They say they will be reported out of committee. This manual addresses that a little bit. And so what they would do, what the priority would be, the committee secretaries, you work on all the positive ones first, and then you work on all the negative ones. And then those that the committees never considered or never adopted a motion on, those all come after the final day for reporting. And that's all placed in the manual. Does that answer your question?
Go ahead.
Maybe, Mr. Chairman, could I have a follow-up?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are you saying that in that case, that it was the majority floor leader that said, we're going to hear a bill that had a recommended do not pass? I actually didn't mind because it was a bill I liked. But was it the majority floor leader that decided that then in that case, you think?
Mr. Chairman, it could have been. I wasn't aware of it, but you should have to suspend the rules because the rules in the House say this is when you'll consider it. And this is the difference in the Senate. If it were in the Senate says for the first 20 days, it's up to the majority floor leader. After the 20th day, the rule places the negative recommended bills below the positive recommended bills.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chairman, having that position, I read the rule. The rule said you got to hear the positive bills first. We didn't get through all the positive bills. So there was no way to reach that bill because the positive bills have to be on the floor heard before the other. And that was my understanding of my reading of the rule.
Mr. Gruber?
Mr. Chairman, that would be correct. And that's why I said you'd have to suspend the rule to hear that negative recommendation first. Because by rule, you have to deal with all your positives first.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Gruber, does this at all change the possibility that a bill in committee can die for fail to have a motion or a second on a motion?
Mr. Chairman, it does not. And those bills are reported after the final day.
Thank you.
All right, take it back up and keep hitting those points.
Page 4.
Be a long day.
Mr. Chairman, they always say, well, how long is this going to take? And I'd always tell the committee, it depends on you.
That's right.
We've already talked about that, Mr. Chairman, so I'll go to That's when we just. I will go to page 8 on the manual, Mr. Chairman. And what we do is, in the House and Senate, you have a difference, and we codify this in the manual, that difference. The House deletes the enacting clause, the Senate never does that, and it allows full debate. The House does it because you have a rule that says you have to have an amendment in order to debate a bill. And we talk about how you're gonna do that, and that's codified again, that's just practice, Mr. Chairman. On page 9, Mr. Chairman, this is a substantive change, but I think everybody agrees with it, but I'll point it out because it's different from Mason's. Mason says that if you have an objection to an amendment not being germane or changing, or not changing the original purpose of the bill, that's not a point of order. That's something for the bodies to decide. Well, in the last few years, for sure, the House has entertained those as a point of order. And in fact, the Senate adopted a rule which says that we will address those as a point of order. And what we do on page 9, the second paragraph, is codify that in the Manual of Legislative Procedures. And it's important that that be codified because even if it's precedent, Masons would put that above. And if you turn to Masons, it would say, no, you don't consider that. That's not an appropriate point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess just a note to self is, mark that one down somewhere, Matt, that, maybe the House rules might want to look to see if we want to follow the Senate, so it's clear in rules. And I mean, it'll be in this, but we may want to examine that. I think we had a few of those, and I hope you guys kept that list.
Go ahead, man. Mr. Gruber, go ahead.
I hesitate to bring this up, Mr. Chairman, but on page 9, the historic practice for co-sponsors for amendments, again, we're just codifying what you've done in the past, and you've done it for at least 20 or 30 years, which is, well, actually depends on the House or Senate. The House limits you to 4 co-sponsors on an amendment. The Senate, you can have 4 sponsors on an amendment in the House, 5 in the Senate, Mr. Chairman. And that's always been a point of contention. But the reason is, what happens is if you get 6 or 7, and then this guy doesn't want to be on or this lady doesn't want to be on, and now you're doing corrected copies, and it just slowed things down. So as a matter of practice, leadership adopted this limit on co-sponsors for amendments, Mr. Chairman. Page 10, you have a substantive change, conference committee actions. And this, again, is historic practice, which is different from Mason's, but this is how we've done it, at least in the last 20 years. And the question is, if one house hasn't taken an action, you have no appropriation, and the other house has a $20 million appropriation. Is a $10 million appropriation between the two? And you could read Mason's to say, no, it's not, because they're not different positions. The one took no position on it. That's not what Wyoming's done. Wyoming said, if you've taken no action and the other house has taken action, something in between those two is appropriate for the conference committee to take up. And we put that in here, and we tried to put an example in. It's pretty easy for money. It's kind of hard, a little harder for language. But what the bottom line is if it's something that's been fairly contemplated by each house, then it's fair game for the conference committee to take up something in between there. And again, I'm only talking about the first conference committee, Mr. Chairman, and all conference committees' actions, they're always going to be subject to a member objecting to the conference committee, not limiting itself to its proper role.
Continue.
Mr. Chairman, page 10, carrying on over to page 11. Again, I'll point it out because it's different from Mason's. Mason's takes the position that one house or the other can make changes and from what they've done and delete amendments that they've adopted, even if the bill is not in their possession. the Wyoming legislature historically has said, fine, you can recede from non-concurrence if the bill's not in your possession, but that's the only thing you can do. You can't make other changes to amendments that you adopted, and this codifies that because it is different from Mason's.
Continue.
Matt, you can slow me down if you think there's an important one. All right, Mr. Chairman, I would go all the way to page 17, and this is an important one. Adoption of joint rules. And this happened in 2021. It's the first time I know that it's happened. And here, joint rules are rules that you both adopt. Well, they're supposed to be identical. Well, 2021, the Senate and the House adopted a different one for interim committees about whether you need a vote of each house or whether you need a majority vote of the full committee. And that had never, LSO had never been confronted with that before. And so Matt's determination or director's determination was the LSO would publish both rules as they were adopted by each house. And the question is, do you have a joint rule or don't you have a joint rule? And for this particular one, LSO wrote a memo and said, well, that'll be for the committees to decide. And our position is it's a majority vote of the entire committee following Mason's. And you had a number of alternatives here, Mr. Chairman, and I can tell you back when Rick Miller was director, they never got to this point, but the question was, well, what happens if we adopt different joint rules? The LSO's advice at that point was, well, you don't have a joint rule. Kind of like a contract, you have no meeting of the minds. Another one, if you follow legal precedent, is like, well, maybe you have a severable joint rule. And so all those parts that are the same are the joint rules, and anything that's different is not a joint rule. And then you have and what's in this manual now is the position that LSO advised you on 2021, and what it took was it would simply reflect the action of each house. And from there on, you can figure it out, depending on what the joint rule is. You'll just have to deal with, if you have a different joint rule, what action you take. And that's all the manual does, but it's an important issue. And I should mention at this point, Mr. Chairman, the manual follows the rules and fills gaps in for the rules. If you change the rules, you have to change the manual at some point. Now, until you get the manual changed and updated, the rules, of course, control.
Continue on.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll just point out this on page 5 of your explanation, is referencing page D, provision 3, and it's really not an important issue, but it's important.
Yeah, where?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, on the explanation, page 5, at the bottom, talking about Appendix D.
Right.
So you can go to Appendix D in the draft. And there's actually two things here, Mr. Chairman. The first one is on D1 of the draft under paragraph 3. And this is for conference committees. And the reason that's put in here is to provide a little bit of guidance and really some backing for leadership. Because, everybody wants in the conference committee an enrolled bill. And enrolled means not engrossed, it's not informal, but it's just LSO putting in the amendments by each house, so because it's easy to follow. Well, you get to the end of session, you just can't enroll every bill. You don't have time unless you want to get a lot bigger staff. And so this talks about when you'll do it, and it'll be prepared at the request of the JCC. And importantly, it's not put on the website. It's not an official version. And that's why that's really in here. is because members of the public, everybody wants this enrolled bill. And you really don't want to send it out because it's just an attorney that went out there and put it in just for convenience of the JCC. And so it's limited to JCC. It's not on the website. The world doesn't get it. The other change, Mr. Chairman, is on D1, on subparagraph 5F. And this is just an exception. And in conference committees, we tell them all the time, you either adopt or delete an amendment that one of the houses do. You don't get to adopt part of an amendment. And F is an exception to that, and we've done it a handful of times. But the situation is maybe you have a 6-page amendment in the House, and you're fine with everything except for the dollar amount. You want $10 instead of $20. Well, you'd have a 10-page JCC report, or maybe you'll have a 1-page JCC report if you say adopt Senate Amendment number 1, Committee of the Whole number 1, on page whatever, paragraph whatever, delete 20, put in 10. And so that exception is just put in the manual so that folks know, yeah, you can do that. That's an appropriate action for JCC to take. Appendix F3.
Just a sec. Mr. Brewer?
Yeah,
Go
thank
ahead.
you. Mr. Gruber, just curious, with that, who makes the determination that it's a rare occasion and that it would therefore be acceptable?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that just the attorney staff and the JCC with the JCC committee chairman making that determination. And it is, again, you know, at the end of the session, you're flying on these things, and it's just like, boy, it would take us 2 hours to do that right. It will take us 5 minutes to do it this quick way, and everybody wants to get out here by 2 o'clock kind of thing. So, okay, that's what we'll do.
I assumed he meant AM. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, you guys have all been around long enough to know that attorneys used to come to me and say, you don't have any rules. And it's like, you follow all the time. It's like, you're right, we don't. And really, the rule that you have is you have to do what you have to do because these guys have 40 and 20 days to get it done. And that's actually what some of these precedents, and that's a great example. It's like, okay, we're going to break that rule because you want to be out by midnight.
Certainly appreciate all your work along the way. All right, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just quickly point out on Appendix Appendix H, you have some insertions in reports from Select Committee, and that just follows the rule on H2, new 9. And then on H3, you have an assertion of action on administrative rules. Again, the Senate has a rule on this, the House doesn't for some reason. But you have a joint rule that says you'll take those actions up, and so we just put that in the appropriate order. Same thing for signing of enrolled acts. Even though it says number 16, as a matter of practice, you folks get that done as soon as they get to your desk, basically, so you can keep on going with things. On Appendix I-1 of the draft, Mr. Chairman, paragraph 2, we add a new I. And this issue came up once, and the question is,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'll be honest, on H3, this kind of slipped by me from when we were doing it, but I don't even recall, when was the last time we addressed an administrative rule during session? I can't remember.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's been at least 20, if not 25 years ago, that you've actually had a legislative order to say, and I think it was a DEQ rule, that they cannot implement that DEQ rule.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I believe, to answer that question, I think Representative Peperinen, when the Attorney General wasn't on the Capitol wasn't providing some guidance that the legislature wanted. He did file an order, and then I think they agreed to provide it, and then it was withdrawn. That's my memory. But I think that may have been one other time. And I think Representative Greer was involved in that, so maybe he remembers that. But
I don't think he remembers. Anyway. Okay, let's go back.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm on I-1 of the appendices, paragraph 2, and we'll put in an I. And the question that came up is, you have in your rules that you'll adopt the old rules when you start a new legislative session, when you start a new legislature. And the question is, well, are those temporary rules, and we want to change those, do they require a 2/3 vote to change or not to change? And the LSO researched it, and what we came up to the conclusion was, you really haven't had a full consideration of those, and so it doesn't require a 2/3 vote. It only requires a majority vote. And the truth is, Mr. Chairman, on all this, you probably have heard this before, but you can always do anything with a majority. It's just suspending the right rules, even the rule that requires a 2/3 vote for suspension of the rules, because you can't have a minority thwart the will of a majority at any point. Mr. Chairman, I'd go to K4. At the very top, and again, this is a codification of practice, but we're putting it in here so everybody knows that you can see it, and a little bit of protection for the legislature, which is if you have an adjourned sine die, then we've informed the governor's office that the clerks are available to accept vetoes. So he only has a 3-day window. And this might be you go home on a Friday and you're thinking of whether you'll come back or not come back. So you keep that 3-day period intact instead of the 15-day. On page K6, again, it's not a big issue, but it's one that comes up because the Constitution seems to speak in mandatory terms that you shall consider each veto. The House and the Senate have both determined that despite that language, you can't require an elected official to take an action that's discretionary. And so you've always determined that you'll only take actions if the bodies decide to, the leadership decides to. And the reason is, if you clearly don't have 2/3 vote to override a veto, why waste the time in making the motion? And I know you've done that for at least, I remember that coming up about 25 years ago.
So on that point, the last comment about if the leadership decides to, I don't think that's accurate, Dave. Anybody can bring the motion to override a veto. Is that fair?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, thanks.
All right. All right, keep going.
Mr. Chairman, Appendix M. This looks like a huge change in striking out all the sample interim committee rules. Well, you actually have those in your rules, and so there's no need to repeat that in the manual, so we strike that. But then if you go to M3, we do put some new things in there, Mr. Chairman. And the first one deals with that adoption of non-identical joint rules. And then we have LSO's advice, again, to codify it. So if folks go away 15 years from now, they'll know that here's what LSO has advised, that majority of membership of the full committee constitutes a quorum, and the majority of the quorum can take any action. And now, of course, the committee could change that and by a majority vote require that each house on the bills, and some committees do that. M3, Mr. Chairman, is one that is worthy of your consideration, debate, and this was in the subcommittee, and it deals with proxy voting and absentee voting. And the subcommittee is one of the things that they did take affirmative action on, the substantive change. And bottom line is proxy voting not permitted. Absentee voting is permitted if the chairman in his discretion or her discretion announces that at the first meeting, regularly scheduled meeting of the committee, and it has to be applied evenly throughout. You can't say this meeting we're going to allow it, that meeting we're not going to allow it. And the other restriction that the subcommittee put on it is that if you're going to allow absentee voting and it's been announced and it's been followed, you only can allow absentee voting if the member has attended a substantial portion of the committee's discussion of the issue. And so if you've discussed an issue throughout the interim and the committee member can't make it for the last vote but says, Mr. Chairman, I want to vote aye on that bill, and the chairman, at his discretion, says, yes, he's attended or she's attended a substantial portion, I'll accept that absentee vote. And so those are the parameters that the subcommittee put on it, and it is an important change. And a little bit of background is, when we brought this to the subcommittee, you've been all over the place on it, depending on your chairman. Some accept it, some don't, and I've watched chairmen not accept it and then accept it. So the subcommittee decided we needed to put this in the manual so it's clear and everybody follows the same rules for all the committees.
So, Mr. President, real quick, do we have a standard for what constitutes an absentee vote? Just not present at the time of the vote, is that absentee?
Mr. Chairman, that's my understanding, and I don't know of a standard. And Masons would say, if you're not present when the question is put,
Okay.
then you're absent. And Masons would actually say in committees, if you're not present when the question is put, you don't get to vote. So this is different.
Modifies it, Masons. All right.
Okay, continue on. Oh, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, this is an important point, and we debated it quite a little bit, but really, we wanted to get back to chairman's discretion, but the chairman has to make an action on it, you know, and so, yes, you got discretion, but you've got to have the forthright to, you know, just take an action, so.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
A question for the subcommittee. It seems to me there's an assumption that your co-chairs of a joint committee agree, and that will treat all members the same, or is it possible that the co-chair on one side will have a different determination than on the other side?
Are you asking committee member Summers?
I am asking the committee, so
Okay,
as we go
ahead,
forward.
Representative Summers?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recall that we discussed that particular point. I thought it was if I'm a House member, which I am, and I had a House chair, my request would go to the House chair. But at the beginning of the committee, you know, process, which chair decides this issue was not resolved in discussion that I recall.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that's my recollection as well, and the way the rule's written, Representative, I believe it would be who's ever chairing the first regularly scheduled meeting is the chairman, and you don't have necessarily, and I guess I haven't been around lately enough to know, but it used to be some committees had one chairman and a vice chairman. I think you've gone to most co-chairmen now, but I don't know that that's true throughout all the joint interim committees.
Representative Conley, that help you?
Mr. Chairman, it seems like it's unclear. I mean, the answer is that it wasn't discussed, and therefore it is unclear.
Go ahead.
So it's pluralized rather than singular in the passage. It's the concept that the chairman in that circumstance would somehow set a policy and theoretically would then be agreeable between the two. I think that's, and I think we did discuss it very briefly, but we didn't dig into it. So it might not be sufficient, but that was my recollection and interpretation. I don't know that it couldn't be established as different based on the structure of the way it's written, where a policy could be established where one chairman was saying it was okay under certain circumstances, and the other, for the other chamber, wasn't. I've seen that before.
Well,
But again, it was an attempt at providing clarity on how that's been done and trying to have some uniformity. It might need better language.
down the road, Mr. Gruber, let's continue on. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think just a note to self on that one for us, that we probably need to clean that up when we go in. Okay.
Okay. I'll leave as is. Proceed.
Well, I mean, Mr. Chairman, this is how I read it, and it's with Senator Rothfuss's interpretation. Because it says, the chairman shall announce the standard at the first regularly scheduled meeting of the committee. So the chairman need to have a meeting of the minds before that first regularly scheduled meeting. They either announce what their meeting of the minds are on absentee voting, or if they can't come to a meeting of the minds, then there is no process announced for absentee voting at that first meeting.
Okay, any follow-up on that? Go ahead.
What if the chairman decided, so you have a interim committee that has co-chairs, right? Which we do have a number of those. And they announced at the first meeting that absentee voting would be determined by the chairman of the individual houses to make a determination. In other words, with that, inconsistent with what you just said, you could have where a house co-chairman says, I'll determine whether the house members, and they state that at the first meeting, that would be the standing rule then adopted, that they could have different bodies actually have different absentee voting rules if they stated that early on at the first meeting. Is that the way you would interpret that?
Mr. Obrecht, you want to follow that?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, I think that's absolutely a possibility. The chairman, if they both agreed on that, to have two different processes for their members and announce that at the first meeting, the way this is written, that would be allowable.
That's the way I read it. Thank you.
Okay.
Better or worse, that's
All
the
right,
way I.
Mr. Gruber.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'll go on to Appendix N, which I notice is, we need to change the lettering to M4. Yeah, but Matt and I, neither one know how to do that, so we know that's a problem. As soon as we find somebody who can, more word savvy than we are, we'll fix that. But in Appendix N, under A4,
Right, where you're
A4,
at.
Appendix N, sponsor approval and bill drafting / co-sponsors. And this is, it's an issue that doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, can be a point of difficulty for staff and members. And it's when you make a change, a substantive change to the bill. And what we put in there is the standard that at least I've used, and I think LSO's used in the past, which is you have all your co-sponsors, and then you say, oh, I want to change this. Well, if it's a substantive change, we say you have to send it out, and the other co-sponsors have to agree to it. Well, what's the substantive change? Well, clearly technical changes aren't. And the standard we try to put in there is, would it affect the legislator's determination of whether he wants to be a sponsor or she wants to be a co-sponsor or not? And what we really do is, for staff's protection, put in the manual, the staff will err on the side of determining that the change is substantive. And you know, that delays the process, and sponsors aren't happy about that, but co-sponsors are a lot more unhappy if now you have a $10 million appropriation in a bill that didn't have that before, and they've had nothing to do with appropriating $10 million kind of thing. The limit on co-sponsors on M4, we talked about that already, and it really is a pure policy decision if you want to change that. The late co-sponsors are the same. The practice is for held bill drafts, all that's the same for the legislative handbook. The other issue I'd point out, Mr. Chairman, is fiscal notes for bill drafts. And the issue appears in subparagraph E on what's labeled M6 in your draft. And this is when, background is, if the bill has fiscal impact, we send it to an agency, the agency says, you know, it's gonna cost $10 million, or if they love the bill, no, it's not gonna cost anything, we can do that. Well, the sponsor is approving both the bill and the fiscal note when they sign off on it. Well, sometimes you'll have sponsors that say, no, they can do that for nothing, and the agency says it's gonna cost us $10 million. And LSO has to make a determination of, well, geez, is the fiscal note correct? And honestly, what they do, the fiscal folks try to deal with the agency and the sponsor and kind of come to a meeting of the minds. But sometimes you just can't do that. And so what this codifies is what we've done in the past, which is, okay, the sponsors approved this so it can get filed, but the sponsor's disagreement with the fiscal note is noted on the fiscal note, Mr. Chairman. And that's really the best resolution we can come up to. It doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes when it does happen, it really can be a contentious issue.
Go ahead.
Would you use your mic?
Mr. Gruber, I had flagged this one as well because I think a word is dropped, and it's the third sentence in E, and it says the works with the sponsor. I assume it's LSO, but because this is so important, I want to just be clear that that LSO is missing, rather than agency or something else that would be so important in there.
Mr. Chairman, that's a great catch, and somehow LSO got changed to probably by autocorrect or something, and I missed it. Representative, it's right, it should be LSO works with the sponsor.
Okay, proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I'll go on M6, amendment procedures. And again, this reflects historically what you've always done. And I'll put it in shorthand terms. Generally speaking, amendments we try to deal with as they come in, they get done. But overriding that is you keep the floor action moving. And so if you have somebody who has a 5-page amendment and you got a bunch of little amendments, we do those and keep those going through. And giving due consideration to, well, it's not fair that this person never gets their amendment done. But at the same time, you can't have one member blocking up the whole thing. It doesn't work that way, and we've never worked that way. And we keep the floor moving. And generally speaking, it's not a problem. Folks, you work with legislators and they understand it. But again, this just codifies it. And really it's, if you have new members come on, it's like, no, I was in there 4 hours before that senator came in. It's like, well, yeah, his was a 1-word amendment for a bill that was up 3 hours before yours. And so that's how we handle it. And really, what all this is really trying to say is you keep it going so nobody has to stand down. I mean, that's the goal of the House and Senate Attorney's Office, is to keep amendments flowing. But we do give due consideration to when the amendments come in.
Thank you. Mr. Floor Leader?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'm not going to be able to whip back in the manual, but if you look in E, it talks about 4 and 5 co-sponsors on an amendment. And I thought somewhere back a ways we had 3 and 4 co-sponsors, like at the beginning of our discussion. Maybe that was budget only or something, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure that there's an inconsistency.
Mr. Chairman, we'll do a search for that, but it should be 3 co-sponsors, 4 sponsors on an amendment in the House, 4 co-sponsors, 5 sponsors on an amendment in the Senate. And I'm not saying it's not wrong, but we can do a search just to make sure it's correct.
Okay. thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, the last one on M that I'll talk about is the confidentiality of amendments. And again, you know, the old, just do it so it works, the best way it works. And it's that there's an implied waiver of confidentiality on your amendment. If you come in and say, I want this amendment, we let any other legislators know that. And if they come in and want pretty much the same thing, we say, hey, Representative Summers is working on that. You want to talk to him? It's a little bit different, and you guys work it out and tell us what you want. We do that, which is different from bills. It's just amendments are, just because of the timing thing, there's a waiver of confidentiality. Now, if you come in and say, and I don't want anyone to know I'm working on this, then that's what we do. Nobody knows they're working on this. And if the next person comes in that wants exactly the same thing, we would do that for Representative Summers, and his would not be confidential, but Representative Connolly's would be, because that's what she asked for. Again, this just codifies that. It's really not been a huge issue, but again, just so it's there, and new members know, and they understand, and it provides some protection for staff to say, hey, here's what, and for House staff too, and Senate staff, here's how we do it. The same thing for distribution, and they've changed this a little bit. Really, the Senate has kind of migrated towards a House position, which is as soon as you're done with that reading, all the amendments you have for the next reading on that bill can go out. In the House, we didn't hold them. We put them out there. The Senate used to hold them. I think the Senate, we talked to the chief clerk, and they've gone more towards this, where we get it out there as soon as that reading's done. Give you as much time as possible, and yet still avoid confusion by not putting it out before the reading's done. Last thing, Mr. Chairman, substitute bills. This just comes from an LSO memo about 20 years ago, and ever since we've done it, it's really helped staff understand it. The reason you want to, I think, put it in here and codify it is because it makes clear two things. One, that a committee chairman can request a substitute bill, and you don't need a formal motion. I remember 25 years ago, it'd be like, no, you can't get a substitute unless you get a committee vote on it. And we've changed that, and historically, only committee chairman can, or committee chairman can request it without committee. And the other part is, members don't get a substitute bill. A lot of times, remember, they change their bill so much, they come down and say, hey, I need a substitute bill. It's like, no, committee chairman get to make that call, or full committees get to make that call.
Okay. All right. Said, what did we just hand out here?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, one more item for your consideration associated with these changes to the Manual of Legislative Procedure. And that is, as we're going, as the subcommittee was working on these changes, another possible consideration for the bodies at this general session were to conform how changes to the manual were made and how that's provided for in the Senate, House, and joint rules. And as you can see, Mr. Chairman, these proposed rules that were adopted by the subcommittee are based on Senate Rule 1-1, where there are no changes. It's simply added here for reference. The Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure shall govern procedural matters for the legislature, not shown elsewhere in these rules and not inconsistent with those found in Wyoming law or constitution. Changes to this manual shall be made only by a majority vote of the Senate. And so the proposed changes to House Rule 1-1 are to include that language from Senate Rule 1-1 in the House, that the manual shall govern procedural matters not shown elsewhere in the rules and not inconsistent with those found in Wyoming law or constitution. Changes to this manual shall be made only by a majority vote of the members of the House. And then on the backside is the change to Joint Rule 10-1, which you can see Joint Rule 10-1 right now says that changes to the manual shall be made only with the consent of the Rules Committee of the House and Senate, which is not consistent with either the Senate rule or past practice of the House or Senate. So we say it shall only be made by a majority vote of the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives voting separately. So, Mr. Chairman, what council could consider is just a motion to forward the changes to the manual as written to the respective rules committees of the House and Senate for consideration for adoption by both bodies during the opening week of the 67th legislature.
Okay, before we do that, any questions on Matt's handout? There being none? Okay, you heard what Matt explained. We can forward on to rules. Any further discussion? Get a
So
motion?
move, I'll make that motion.
A motion and second?
Yeah, you
Rules of the
forward this off, we forward these recommendations to,
The ones we've discussed so far? Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a second? Well, we have a motion. Let's get a second, then we'll have you discuss. Any second? Okay, we've got a second. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have a couple questions here. These references to the legislature's interpretation to the Constitution, and I've seen it twice in here. There's this one on page 2 on the timing of appropriations, and there's another one later in here that I circled. I mean, my view is I don't think we should be doing that. On the veto, that's the other one. Whether, I mean, to me, the consideration, I mean, I think reviewing it, the act of, there doesn't need to be a motion for consideration, I really, in my view, but I just don't think that should be in here. So I guess my question is, I mean, especially on the first one, this timing of appropriations, I mean, have you thought about that? And then the other question I have is, okay, so, Senator Rothfuss said that our consideration today, in his view, is that we should be codifying what's in practice. And, I guess the question is, how does something become practice and how do you amend this thing? If when we're reviewing it, we're saying that we're just gonna be codifying whatever's practice. It's kind of a circularity. And at the end of the day, how you get something in here is it makes something part of tradition, which question is who does that? And I guess a lot of it is the presiders with the LSO when that moment comes up. But yeah, I wanted to ask those questions earlier, so appreciate it.
Let's go to either of you two gentlemen, and Ms. Florida, you're welcome to weigh in too. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, first question on constitutional references or the legislature's interpretation of the Constitution. Well, every branch in carrying out their duties interpret the Constitution, and ultimately under Marbury versus Madison anyway, the courts have the final interpretation. But before it gets to the courts, or if it never does get to the courts, each branch in carrying out its own duties interprets their Constitution. And there's at least two, the specific references that we put in here. One is the Constitution says you have to have unanimous consent for any appropriation within the last 5 days of session. Well, you've had special sessions that have been less than 5 days. And so the LSO's advice and what the legislature has followed is, well, yeah, we can make appropriations without unanimous consent in those circumstances. Otherwise, one member can shut down the whole special session. Now, whether that's interpretation right or wrong, the courts obviously can say differently if they want to, if it's ever challenged. But until then, what this is trying to do is say, here's what we've done before. So here what your precedent is, what your own practice is. And, honestly, Masons and Cushings and all those things, and the manual's the same way. It's a recitation of what each legislature's done every 2 years for the past whatever number of years, and really since LSO's been in existence is all we can go back to give you advice. And it's really just saying, here's what you've done before. And again, based on what the subcommittee does, you can always say, well, a majority vote's going to overrule that precedent because we're going to do what we want to do now. But you just put it in there just to inform the bodies of what's going on. And again, yeah, would they know? Well, yeah, maybe somebody know, maybe the senator who's been here for 35 years is no longer here to tell you, here's what we've always done. So we're trying to put that in the manual. And that kind of bleeds into your second question, Representative. Well, why do you do this? What makes precedent? Well, precedent is just what you've done before. And I think the reason you do that and why you codify is just like, we found this to be the most efficient way of handling business. And rather than let's debate each time when an issue comes up, we can say, here's what we've always done. We're going to keep doing it that way unless there's a reason to debate doing it differently. So I hope that answers your question.
Representative Gray, good? Okay, all right. I think the senator will make 45 years and we'll always be able to ask him. Go ahead.
That's right. Mr. Chairman, and just to follow up on what Dave was saying, that is the reason for a lot of the concerns that you expressed, Representative, are the reasons for the simple majority override, is to ensure that this document is not to the same level as rules. And if the chamber decides that it doesn't like the previous precedent that was here, effectively, a simple majority will is going to override that. And your second question was, how do you change this or how do you set this? It's changed, and as a first approximation, what we're doing right now is changing it, just submitting a new document for the next legislative session. It is subject to amendment as the rules are going into the new session. So while we didn't want to be changing anything or setting new policy, it's open for debate as it goes to the floor in exactly the same way the rules are open for debate as they go to the floor. So if the body wanted to spend a long time debating the nuances of this prior to adoption, it certainly could. I hope not, but, but it's available.
Not too. Okay, we have a motion, a second. Go ahead.
I do want to note on this, Mr. Chairman, I think most of these things have been present. I do think there is one exception, though, that is glaring to me. There's hundreds of changes here, but the absence policy in voting, that was on committee voting on M3, joint interim committees. I mean, I've been on committees for a long time. I don't think I've ever heard an absence policy at that first meeting until it comes up. I've heard it when it comes up, and I've heard it once in my memory. Granted, maybe I don't remember. So I do think this, if this is going to be the policy, there needs to be some education, because the way this reads is if it's not announced, then there is none. And I think that will be something that would be contentious. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion on the table, moved and seconded. We're moving it on to Rules Committee in the next session. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. Onward. Let's take a quick 15-minute break. Stretch. Go ahead.
I do have a couple of comments about this, and I'm just curious from the subcommittee. First, you did a good job. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work. Oh, okay, Mr. Gruber did a good job. But honestly, it kind of follows along with Representative Gray's concerns about how to change things. But two things. One that I noticed was that their obligations of staff are slightly different between the House and the Senate, especially with the movement of bills and what happens with chairs and moving it to the front desk. And it just seems an artifact of history, honestly. And I was curious if the committee even considered having some consistency. It didn't seem like to be a major difference, but it would allow for, honestly, shifting of staff between the House and the Senate over the years, and not having staff need to learn the new procedures. That would be, to me, a nice, efficient cleanup, and I'm curious if that was talked about at all. So that's my first one.
Go ahead. We're going to take them all at one time.
Okay, and then the second one is it's 2023, or it will be. It's time to make this thing gender neutral. And I'll be honest with you, I caught in here once where you actually use his or her. So I would say you had made a mistake there, but I think it is time to make this gender neutral so that we don't have the presiding officer going back to his seat, which I caught in here as well. So those are the two things that I'm curious if there were discussion about, or what we can do about it.
Either one? Matt?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conley, there wasn't a specific discussion about gender neutrality within this. Of course, like, as you know, with all our drafting, we try to keep it as gender neutral as possible. And probably like our drafting statutes, we don't use his or her, or at least in this, as much as other documents do now, just because we're not used to using it in our bill drafting either. We can certainly take a look at it again, and before presentation to the floor, see if we could make it more gender neutral. As to your first question, the subcommittee did not have a specific discussion about conforming the processes within the House and Senate. But what we did do was in December of 2021, we had an afternoon-long meeting with myself, the chief clerks, Ian Shaw's legal division administrator, Tamara Revelay as legislative counsel, and Tanya Heitrick, operations administrator. I don't think you were at that one, Dave, but, and discussed all of these changes, and the chief clerks had this document and suggested their own changes, and they made sure they were comfortable with the procedure as laid out. And probably each house is comfortable with their own procedures, and as long as we can get the bills then over to the other house, I think that both chief clerks and myself were fine with leaving the procedures as they are in each body.
Representative, good? Okay. All right. Mr. Groover, we need you connected to this body in some form or fashion for all the days of your life. Thank you for all of this. Okay. All right, let's take a break. 15 minutes. It's 10:30. Let's go 10:45. Grab a coffee, a soda, bathroom break. Thank you. Let's bring in Greer and get started. There we are. Thank you, Mr. Greer. Okay, let's go to legislative compensation. Speaker Barlow is going to lead us in that, along with Matt. Thank you. And my two other colleagues are on their way. Let's go ahead and start.
Thank
You
you,
see him out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Representative Barlow, part of Management Council, part of the group that was tasked by the presiding officers to examine this subcommittee's work. I was joined by Representative Conley, Representative Brown, Senator Baldwin, Steinmetz, and Garou. So that was your subcommittee that did this, assisted by our staff. In your packets, you have numerous documents that talk about legislative workload and legislative comparative salaries, et cetera. Much of this work was initially put together in 2020 and was updated subsequently for the last 2 years of work. So this is something that Management Council, previous Management Council probably reviewed. This Management Council, or staff updated it for the current Management Council. So Director Obrick, do you want to add anything before we actually, unless there's questions on the supporting materials, we're just going to walk through the bills, take questions on bills, and then the committee can decide how it wants to proceed. Director Obrick, with your permission, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, members of council, just by way of background on how we got here today, was in the 2019 interim, council at that time took a fairly in-depth look at legislator compensation, sponsored a number of bills during the 2020 session. The one that passed was to provide legislators workers' compensation coverage. At your January meeting of this year, the motion was made for a subcommittee of Management Council to meet and propose various amendments to the legislator compensation model and package that's provided. And the subcommittee, as Vice Chairman Barlow mentioned, met twice, and these bills are a result of the work of that subcommittee.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt. With that introduction, appreciate it. Appreciate the work of staff in updating some of these materials that we used. I think we're going to try to take them in order. It's not the numerical order of the bills. It's, I think, an order that we can march through in fairly good order and fairly good time. The first one will be the Legislative Constituent Service Allowance, which is draft 0231.0.3. So Legislator Constituent Service Allowance. First of all, I preface this by saying there's two things that a legislature cannot do for itself constitutionally: raise its salary or its mileage. Well, we've actually approached all of these bills where this current, except for this one, the remaining three, they would not take effect during this current legislature. For the 67th, for the 67th, they would take effect afterwards. This is the one exception. Actually, my apologies. This is also included in that. So this one also does not affect the current legislature. So, or the succeeding legislature, the 67th, this would take effect in 68th legislature, the way it's drafted by the effective date. And there were two bills on this one. We had a bill that just raised the dollar amount. So page 2 of the bill just goes from $750 to $1,000. Constituent allowance, as you know, that's a quarterly payment, if you will, for services for which our salary per diem and mileage are not being provided or not being provided. So $1,000 per quarter. Basically, it's $1,000 per year more per legislators, 3/4, $250 per quarter, $1,000 more per year for this. Does not take effect for that. We had a second bill that was the large district bill. And we went around, we talked about formulas. Is it square mileage? Is it number of municipalities, et cetera, et cetera? And it wasn't that it wasn't interest to the committee, it just got to be complex, and we thought maybe that's something we actually kicked to the next management council. This one was, this is a bill you can go straight to statute with, and people understand it. The complexity of the other one with the large districts, which certainly Senator Hicks has one of those, currently Representative Paxton's, that one, anyway, it just became more complex, and we just decided keep thinking or looking at that one. So I'd be glad to take questions. This is a pretty straightforward one. Adds $1,000 a year or $250 a quarter. Mr.
Chairman.
President.
Go ahead.
How did you come up with $1,000? Was there a formula there, or did,
No, Mr. President, no. There was nothing magical about the adding of $250. I would say there was testimony from several legislators about, like, let's say, doing a mailing within a district. And the cost of postage or the cost and how much things have increased in the last year. We're going to get to that when we get to our letterhead and our cars. Just the cost of service has gone up. So but there was no magic formula about the $1,000. No, sir, Mr. President.
so real quick, Matt,
Go
when
ahead.
did the constituent service allowance come into effect?
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the constituent service allowance had been in effect for a number of years, since at least the 1980s. But then the big change, prior to 2013, you had to submit your receipts. And it was reimbursement up to $750 a quarter. After 2013, it became an automatic payment, no need to submit receipts for reimbursement after
What year was
2013.
that?
I think that was 2013.
Okay. All right. Back to you. No?
And Mr. President, unless there's questions, I mean, we can just walk through all the bills, and if there's subsequent actions that people want to take on the bills, we can do that at the end. However you want to do that, Mr. President.
I think I'd like to just walk through them all, and then we'll come back and see if we want to move any through before lunch.
All right,
Get it done.
thank you. With that, Mr. President, we'll go to legislator per diem, which is 0228, working draft, point 4.
Go ahead.
This, Mr. President, this is also a bill which is basically a number, and it's currently, the 155 is based on the federal rate. So 155 would be the federal rate if we were basing on the current federal rate. And then as you see the new language, we're going from $109 as a strike to the current federal rate. And then we provide the auditor the ability every July 1st to reset that standard per diem. The thing about this one that I think we have to keep in mind is many of our boards and commissions are also tied to the legislator per diem rates, whether you're on the livestock board or the Game and Fish Commission or et cetera. And we actually do have a list of all of them that are tied to the legislative per diem rate. And so that's one of the reasons, I mean, anyway, that's one of the things that's tied to this. It's not just the legislators that this impacts. Therefore, you have two different appropriations when you get into Section 2, one for the legislature and then one for generally funded agencies that would have per diem tied to the legislative. And then C and D C goes into those that are not general fund sourced, but also receive per diem based on the legislative rate. So they would have to come up with their own funds for that. So that's also one that doesn't take effect. Actually, this one takes effect in the second half of the 67th legislature. So a year from this coming January. And obviously the dates can be changed. This is the one that actually will impact the next legislature. The rest are all effective dates for the following or two subsequent legislatures when we get to the next one. So this is one that is, effective date in the current draft 2024. be glad to stand for questions, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Chairman, a question on that, because this one's not this is not controlled by the Constitution that we can't raise our salary.
Go ahead.
I know we all change, motels are now 140, 50 bucks a night. So why put this off until January of 2024, knowing that in the interim, we're going to bear significant expenses that we're not being covered by our per diem? And so why the rationale of kicking it out 1 year instead of just getting it done?
Speaker?
Well, because we wanted, Mr. President, we wanted Chairman Hicks to bring that motion.
Done.
Mr. President?
Roll call, Mr. Greer. Representative.
Yeah, thank you. Speaker Barlow, just quick question. I've been a strong advocate of this, brought it a couple of times in the past. My recollection was, I just want to make sure the language on page 2, 6 and 10, or line 6 through 10, regarding the adjustment is, I just want to make sure it's correct. My recollection was there were 2 different per diem rates in Wyoming. There were 2 different regions, Teton County, and at one point in time, like Sweetwater County was another one. Is that still the case? Is this standard rate the right language? Just want to make sure it's drafted correctly.
Speaker Barlow?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Greer's memory is correct. There are at least 3 different rates, I think, right now, for Teton and Sublette, and then also for Park County. And so the standard rate would be the rate for the rest of the state of Wyoming, and that is $155 a day currently.
Mr. President, if I could respond to also in a more appropriate sense, maybe to what Senator Hicks's question was. It was most of an administrative thing. So either the first of the year or the first of the fiscal year, July 1st would be a I guess for our administrative side for both LSO, but more importantly for all those boards and commissions. So they would have, they would be able to get it in place, the policy in place or whatever. So that's the real reason. But we just chose a year from now, so as a marker. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, Mr. Florida.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I know it's in the material, but I think it's important on the mic, to talk about what other, that Wyoming's way down the line on per diem with regard to other states. And I'm just looking through here, Colorado 234, Idaho 139, this is abbreviation, Montana 126, 155, Nebraska, Nevada 155. I mean, there's conditions on all of these, but we're way down the line. So that, I think that's important to talk a little bit about that as we, as we have a public hearing on this.
Gentlemen?
Mr. President, certainly the supporting materials we are low in the, at the lower end of the spectrum on per diem and many other things. And I think what Senator Hicks mentioned earlier, we know hotel rooms that wipe out your entire per diem, not getting a meal or et cetera. So I think that there is also a good point to be made with Representative Greer's point is maybe we should actually have the per diem reflected for the actual area that you're actually serving in. So if there is a committee meeting in Sublette County and it's a different per diem rate, maybe we should have the base and then any those higher rates. If you're in Teton County or Park County, it is more. So maybe we should have actually not just the standard for the entire state, but we should actually adopt what the GSA does, I guess the General Services Administration does for the state of Wyoming for meetings that are held within those areas. That's a little more nuanced, but maybe that's to Senator Hicks's point, I guess, is if it's going up, we know it's going up differently in different places. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Speaker?
I'm not familiar with GSA's model. Don't they already do that?
Mr. Speaker?
Mr. President, if I could, I think standard, there is a standard, and then there are exceptions. So I think we would want to actually maybe strike a couple words and the most relevant per diem rate established, or something like that, so it's not the general or standard per diem. But Mr. Obrecht?
Go ahead.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, I do think if we wanted the per diem rate to be adjusted for the location, we would need some different language in here. Right now, and what was contemplated when council sponsored this bill was that the state auditor would get to adjust it for just one rate, and that was the standard rate for Wyoming, not the deviation for the higher locations.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, how much additional work is put on our LSO staff if we start getting into adjusted schedules and rates?
Mr. Chairman, it is not a substantial amount of work. I mean, if the meeting's located in Jackson, we would know what that per diem rate is. The auditor would set that rate when GSA makes their adjustments every year. We would know that, we'd be able to adjust it. There would be some additional work on A&I's side then on the payouts to the boards and commissions who met in those locations as well. But it's not, I probably shouldn't speak for Heather on this. She is here. So she could, if I'm wrong, she can correct me on that. So.
Thank you. I was trying to stand up for her.
All right. Go ahead.
So I pulled up GSA and was looking at the rates, and I note that their current rates are for October 2022 through September of 2023. So their window, and I don't know, I know occasionally they change their mileage mid-year a variety of times, but I don't know that they change their per diem and M&IE at different times throughout the year. So it's possible that July 1st isn't the right date. I realize that's just a little trivial note, but was there any discussion about what the right date to choose is? I know why we did July 1st. Makes sense for us, but with regard to the GSA schedule, was there discussion about that?
Gentlemen?
Mr. Chairman, I don't remember any subcommittee discussion on the date, but I would note that that is also the date the state auditor adjusts the mileage rate as well. Yeah, just once a year.
Okay. Wait. Mr.
Chairman, on the state, it's done, I mean, we just, on that July 1 of every year, I am not sure if GSA will modify that date throughout the year or not.
Go ahead.
The only thing I looked at this is, we're going to be appropriating money, and I think it would be more appropriate to work on our fiscal calendar than it would be a calendar date, just to match up with our budget process.
Change if needed.
Particularly as this changes, as GSA changes, if we use the January date, it doesn't reflect the changes, and so we're projecting it. We just make it cleaner to follow our fiscal.
Change if needed. Okay. Go ahead.
Mr. President, so I think that obviously what Senator Roth has talked about, I think that is, they're following the federal fiscal year. We're going to try to adopt the state fiscal year as our trigger point. We're going to be 9 months behind or whatever that lag is. And I believe that the mileage, at least my recollection from the livestock board, it's actually changed quarterly. So if there's a certain percentage change, they'll change it quarterly. And that happened at one point, I remember, fuel prices went way up and the federal government responded in the middle of that change. So anyway, but it's also on their fiscal year, on the federal fiscal year. So thank you, Mr. President.
Let's go ahead and finish this one out then.
I think, Mr. President, there may be some adjustments that need to be made to the appropriations, just if we're going to actually back it up 6 months for the effective date. I don't know that. Staff will give us some feedback on that, but maybe just that. And then, yeah, that would be it. So I think what I've heard is change the effective date to July 1st, 2023. And like I said, there may be an adjustment needed, but that can be dealt with in the 67th legislature as an amendment in whatever committee gets it.
Okay.
And, excuse me, Mr. President, and if we want to go to that little more inclusive language of the rate established for the area where the meeting is held, the per diem associated with the different regions. And certainly, I'm sure our staff can come up with something that works for that.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next one.
Mr. Chairman, the next bill, if you're ready to proceed.
Go ahead.
Let's do the state officials compensation bill. This is 0229, version .3. Mr. President and members of council, this has two components to it. The first component is a suggestion of how it's done elsewhere, and it's the establishment of a commission. And this commission would actually evaluate salaries for state officials, and that would be, appointed and elected officials. It has nothing to do with employees of the state, but appointed and elected officials, that would include executive branch, judiciary, and legislative branch. So they'd be making recommendations that would go forth to the, to the judiciary, if it's judicial things, and then to the executive branch and to the legislature. Certainly, the members of the legislature would still have to approve those, just like we do now. But this would give a body that actually looks at this and does it. You can see the membership is on page 3, and I'm not going to go through this in detail. Either like it conceptually or not, and then we can go through the details.
No, let's go with conception.
Yep, the membership, you can see the membership is 7 members. Only 1 from each body of the legislature, a couple from the judiciary, and 3 from the governor. Meeting a couple times, and then how they make their recommendations is on page 4. Anyway, so and then on page 5, you'll see the beginning of the list of the folks that this would be pertain to. And the one thing that may be of interest to you is you see district attorneys broken out. Obviously, county attorneys that is established by otherwise in statute. They would not be involved in the county attorneys, just the district attorney. With that, Mr. President, the second part of the bill, which is only a page, or the last 2 pages, is setting a new salary for legislators. It's currently at $150 per day, and this would establish a new salary for legislators of $230 a day, and it would not take effect until the 69th legislature. So it was going to skip. So nobody currently in office, whether you are you're being elected for your first term as a senator, that would be after this current term. So if someone is elected and begins serving in 2023, this would not affect them any time in their term in office. It would take effect after their term of office. And that's one of the provisions in the Constitution. And I know there have been discussions about whether you can actually just skip 2 years, because it's a new legislature, but this actually skips term of office completely. So no one that's elected, and if this were adopted, no one that's elected and begins serving in 2023 would receive the benefit in this. Everyone would have stood for election again.
They have to come
To
back.
receive it, they would have stood for election again and been elected.
Okay.
The $230, if there's a question about how arbitrary is that, the last time this was changed was in 2005, and it was, Director, remind me what the dollar was then, or remind the body where we were.
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was $116 a day then.
Okay, so 2005 is the last time it was changed. So from 2005 until 2020, the average state increase in salary puts us at about $218. That's 2020. So this is just using this, if you want to call it, not inflation, but using the additive increases to get us to 2020, not 2027. Not 2027, which is when this actually takes effect, not 2020. So that's the body, that's the second part of the bill. First part is the commission, second part is the increase legislative salary to $230 a day.
Okay.
So,
Questions? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, a question for both the speaker and then also for staff. It seems to me like we're mixing two different concepts here. One's to establish a commission. The other one's to raise a salary rate. I'm just concerned that this probably should have been in two bills instead of one bill, given the nature of the differences of what we're dealing with. But some discussion.
Thoughts on that? Go ahead. Speaker?
Mr. Chairman, I did think about the constitutional restriction on whether you have a single subject rule. I don't believe so. They're not subjects that are so disparate as to not be able to be considered within the two. You've got an increase in compensation for the legislature and the creation of a commission that will recommend other salary adjustments for state officials, including legislators in the future. So I don't believe that the Supreme Court would look at those two topics as being so disparate as to violate the single subject rule. Now, certainly, this council can decide to split those into two drafts if you're more comfortable with that. Or conversely, if you want to put some of these bills into one legislator compensation bill as well, you can do that. They were split out for ease to understand.
Anyone else have any concerns on that matter? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Did you guys run the cost of what that council would be? So what kind of, is that within the appropriation?
Mr. Chairman, yep, it's $5,000 and it's just per diem and mileage for that commission. Just like a legislator, actually.
All right. Further questions on this?
Yeah, Mr. President.
Go ahead. We got you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would feel much better. So I won't be around. And I think that the increase in legislative salary is much needed. I really feel strongly about that. I listened in on the first meeting of this commission or of this subcommittee, is very supportive of their work. I am concerned about the establishment of the commission, and I think there are two different items that should be brought before the body and debated separately. And so those are my opinions on that. I have brought and have advocated for some of these for the legislature over the years. And I would strongly recommend we at least give a good thought about breaking out the commission, the compensation commission, as a separate bill, and have management council just stick to the issue of compensation for legislators.
Okay.
Thank you.
We can probably do that towards the end if somebody would like to do that. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if there was discussion about indexing this in some way as effectively is being done for the per diem, where the index takes place, because you'll link it to GSA. And I feel like I've had a conversation about this before, but I don't remember whether we decided it was constitutional to index or not. So I just wanted to explore that discussion.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, there was limited discussion about it in the subcommittee. I don't think there was much interest. I think I have more interest in that than the subcommittee did, and same with the other state officials' compensation. And I don't think it is a constitutional violation if you index, because you're not changing your own salary. That would be set by the 67th legislature for the 69th, and then onward from the 69th.
Mr. Chairman, just clarification.
Follow-up. Did you have a follow-up? No. Go ahead, Vice President.
Just clarification on So when you say it has to be approved, even if it's indexed, it still would have to be approved, but if we index it and said it's just that, we wouldn't have to go back and approve that, correct?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's exactly right. You don't have to go back and improve it. What the Constitution says is that one legislature cannot increase its own compensation. So if you indexed for the out years, if you indexed in the 67th legislature for the 69th legislature, and then for the 70th, you're still not changing your own compensation. But you don't need.
It's how we would index it to be able to address that issue.
Right.
Okay.
In fact, Mr. Chairman, you've got, for judges right now, a provision that, you know, we've got a statutory salary for judges set. Then you've got a provision that says that you can change that through budget bill amendment to reflect whatever increase is given to state employees. It's never been used, though. So I wouldn't suggest an indexing like that that would require further legislative action.
All right. Go ahead.
Just briefly on follow-up for that, I mean, we look at this bill and 2027 is when it's drafted for good reason. So 5 years out is what we're considering at this point in time. This just shows the nature of how challenging of a problem this is. And this bill would still be a political challenge to pass. It almost seems like we should at least have a discussion about some type of indexing to save the future legislators from having to repeatedly go through this problem. Those legislators can always come back in, just as a point of clarification, and stop a pay increase statutorily. It's just which, you know, what's going to be the default position. So something to think about. We would be taking the onus off of the 5-year required delay.
Representative Connolly, did I see a hand?
Thank you, Mr. President. And just to kind of follow up, the discussion that I remember in the subcommittee was limited about indexing. And I even remember back to my very first session when I served on TRW, and we talked about indexing fees for game and fish. And I was told that we have no appetite in this body at all for indexing at all, and have heard about it abdicating our role as legislators, et cetera, et cetera. And so we didn't go down that road, but the road we did go down is about the commission. And that the idea that we're kind of talking about here is that it is very difficult for this body to vote for a pay increase. And whether it be for tomorrow or 4 years out or 10 years out, it's really difficult. And so the better way to think about kind of the needed raise, and let's just say that the committee agreed that we needed to raise salaries, is through a commission rather than indexing, because of the lack of appetite for indexing.
Further comments? Let's go back to either of you two. We're good with that one?
Mr. Silva, thank you, Mr. President. All good comments, and yes, it's easily two bills, two different type of approaches, and certainly the dates and then dollar amounts, that's all subject to amendment as well. So if there's no further questions, Mr. President, I'll go to the fourth bill.
Yep.
This is 0227, version .2, legislator healthcare. This is a bill, actually had several colleagues testify on this bill. Has been before this body before. Some members of the legislature actually suspend their employment while they're serving in the legislature, and that suspends their coverage, their healthcare coverage. So how do they run that gap while they're in the legislature? We had two legislators who spoke to that particular point. So this is the ability for a member that goes right into our Title IX, goes right into Title IX, creates a new section for legislators, authorizes current statute, this is on page 5, excludes or accepts legislators as not being eligible for health insurance under the state plan. Certainly, and then you go to page 7, it's also in, the first 3 pages are just about the requirements. These are requirements that are under employees, they're under officials, and now they would be also applicable to members of the legislature as another group of people eligible for state health insurance. And then it has the removal of the exception as well on page 7. And then it defines what a member of the legislature is. The final page, this would also be applicable on the first of the next fiscal year, the way it's currently drafted. Two things that, or there's probably three things that, one, there's a simpler version that was handed out to you, or I shouldn't say simpler version. There's another version. It's 30316. And what this version does, instead of bringing a whole bunch of new language in the statute, it just says members of the legislature are officials. And so we're just tagging on to something that's already in statute. And so it would include us with these top 5 electeds, with that many of that same list we just saw in the other bill. It just makes us part of that. So members of the legislature are now officials, and as a member, you're eligible for the insurance, and then we kick it off. So this is a simpler version, if you will, because it doesn't duplicate the first 4 pages of the previous bill. 3 pages.
What was the feeling to bring both of them forward, just to?
Mr. President, so the first bill was drafted by our LSO at our request.
Okay.
And then as I reviewed the bill and reviewed the title,
Said we've already
I
got
just
it.
felt like there was maybe a more efficient way to get the job done without
Okay.
duplicating language that's already in statute twice, and we're going to put it in a third time under a new category. And so I was just trying to make it official. All that official is not is a legislator in current statute. It seemed
Makes it
straightforward
official.
way. There's one more thing that is not in this bill draft that I've visited with the director about, found it over the weekend, finally. It took me a while to find it, is currently your medical, the employee part comes out of your salary for employees and officials. Well, legislators, we don't get a consistent salary, if you will. We get a salary, don't get me wrong, but we don't get a monthly salary like those other officials do. So we'd have to make some adjustment to the language if you decided to move forward with either of these, so that they could, accrue, if you will, their side of it during the session, let's say, and then that carries over during the interim, so they would be covered during their interim. The second part of the discussion that we did not have as a committee is whether the state's going to pay the employer side of it, and then the legislator pays it, or is there a way to just say, the legislator, if you want access to this, you pay the entire employer side of it? I get that's, I know that, basically doubles the cost, or depending on the plan, but that way there is no net loss. I mean, there is no net cost to the state. There's a reason why maybe you actually adjust the legislator constituent allowance, or you adjust the pay so you can help somebody that needs health insurance cover it out of their own paycheck, and not the state not being a contributor in that. I'm not suggesting that's the right way to do it. I'm just saying there's 2 ways to approach that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. That's it. Go ahead.
Are there any requirements, and I can't remember, statutorily, if you're over 50% employed, I believe the state has an obligation to provide you with health insurance for any other employee. I don't know that there's any sort of a minimum, so I was just checking to make sure that that isn't a necessary piece of the bill relating to the number of hours you work or the amount of time you work or anything along those lines to be eligible to engage in the EGI as it's currently structured.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, you are right. Currently, as those statutes are drafted or are adopted, you have to work over 50% to be eligible for EGI. We simply amend those statutes to say legislators. Yeah, can be.
All right.
Despite that.
Go ahead.
Okay. Family versus individual, I assume that once you have eligibility for EGI, at that point, it's up to the standard selection process. So we're not being restrictive on which plan you choose or anything along those lines, right? It's either you're okay to be engaged or you're not, pursuant to any other employee. Fair? Okay.
All right. We're coming up on the time for technology and process, so
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
A couple more questions on that. My recollection is AWAC employees are not covered under the state employees' health insurance program was one. Am I correct there?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, you are correct.
With, Mr. Chairman, if I could, with one exception, the Livestock Board, there is actually a provision in statute that allows them to be covered by employer side. But yes, in general,
All the
yes.
brand
So-
inspectors.
And then the scenario that Representative Speaker Barlow that you print, that they would pay 100% out of their salary. At that point in time, why don't they just go to the market and pay 100% for insurance anyway out of their salary instead of into the state group health insurance program?
Go ahead. You one?
Mr. President, so I guess we can all talk about our individual experiences buying health insurance on the open market. I can tell you mine was nearly $30,000 5 years ago when I was still paying it that way.
So there would still be financial incentive to do that, even if they were.
Mr. President, I think that one, there's an eligibility issue because this is, I mean, if you're eligible, you can get in. I mean, you can get into the system. And
Sure.
two, I think there's still, because of the size of the group, there's probably still, I'm just going to guess, significant cost savings to an individual. And they would have the choice at least. I don't know that they would exercise the choice, but they would have the choice. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. All right, for time, let's do this. Matt, you, Director. We take each one of these, help me out with this. We take each one of these individually and consider moving it on. We have to take the one bill and split it up as far as topics go.
So, Mr. Chairman, what you can do on any of these bills presented to you is decide whether you want to sponsor them today, whether you would like to amend them in some form, either by splitting them out, combining some of the bills, amending them in a different way. You will also have a meeting again before the session in
Right.
December, so you can carry them over for further
Let's do
consideration.
this. Would you just recap each one for us real quick? Really quick.
You bet.
And then we'll ask, as you do that, we'll ask if anybody wants to move it forward or wait till December.
Okay,
Go ahead.
great. Mr. Chairman, the first one you heard today was 23 LSO 231, Legislator Constituent Service Allowance, that increases your quarterly constituent service allowance from $750 to $1,000,
You would like to,
Are you looking for a motion, Mr.?
right,
effective in 2 years, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I would move to adopt.
second? Moved and seconded, either one, Conley or Driscoll. Conley, Hicks, Conley. Further discussion? Okay, call for the motion. All in favor, say aye. Oh, it's roll call because it is. Okay, roll call. Let's do it.
Senator Driscoll,
Aye.
Wait. Fair enough, yeah. Do we have public testimony? This is on House Legislative Constituent Service Allowance, 23 LSO 0231. No public testimony. Roll call.
Senator Driscoll,
Aye.
Senator Hicks,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott, excused, Senator Rothfuss, Representative Connolly, Representative Gray, Representative Greer,
Aye.
Representative Summers, Vice Chairman Barlow, Chairman Dockstader.
No. Passes. Read out the vote count for us, total.
You have 7 ayes, 2 noes, 1 excused.
Thank you. All right, 0231 passes, moved on. Next one.
Mr. Chairman, next one is 23 LSO 228. It is legislator per diem.
Move, second. Summers, Rothfuss, go ahead. Discussion.
Do we want to amend this one now?
Yes.
Okay, good, let's roll then.
Good. Amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I would move to amend the bill to an effective date of July 1st of 2023.
Okay, everybody clear on that? Is there a second? Second. Discussion on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
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 Amendment passes. Now back on the bill. You have a comment on the amendment? Okay, back on the bill. Any further discussion on the bill? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be a no on this bill. I think there's a couple problems with it. First of all, the constitutionality issue. I believe that under the constitutional provision, this would be viewed as a salary increase. And there's a number of reasons why, unless you have receipts being submitted, there is no way to prove that your expenses are matching the amount you're receiving from per diem. And my belief is across the average, and yes, when you're doing interim committees in another community with a 2-day hotel stay, you might go over this, but the vast majority of the time in session, you are not, because people are usually in Airbnbs or have negotiated some long-term rate at a hotel, and occasionally are staying in their homes or with individuals they know. So I believe that there is a reasonable assumption that this is a salary increase and should be, and then you add on the Cheyenne issue, which is that Cheyenne is subject to the full per diem increase, so they're receiving that full per diem during the session when they're staying in their homes. And the LSO recognizes that per diem as salary, in fact, for tax purposes, because reasonably that should be viewed as a salary increase. So I think you have constitutional concerns. I think the increase is too high. I mean, Majority Floor Leader Summers was reading off other states. I heard 2 states in our surroundings that are lower, Idaho and Montana, just off those 4 or 5 that were read. So I think it's too high of an increase, and I think, not bringing out Cheyenne, I object to on a substantive point, and then also I think the constitutional concerns, just in general, and then also in the Cheyenne perspective, I think this would be viewed as a salary increase, especially for those Cheyenne legislators. So I'm going to be a no. Thank you.
Follow up, further discussion? Mr. Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think the one thing we always talk about hotel rates, right? And so during session, yeah, your hotel rate is probably lower, probably a lot higher on the interim. But what we don't talk about is food. So yeah, you don't have to eat, but the inflation, if we've all been to the restaurants lately, and if you go to a restaurant now and you get dinner, or if you get breakfast or whatever you get, if it's 1 meal or 2 meals, it's increased substantially. And so I think we have to, of all of the bills that are presented here on this issue today, I think this one is the most important to me, because I think we have to get this reimbursement right to legislators and not continually to eat into our salaries. So I'll be an aye on this. I certainly understand the good representative's concerns on the constitutional.
Thank you. Further discussion? Mr. Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be an aye as well, and I think it's absolutely critical, this part of it, that we have legislators that actually can come down here without paying money out of our pocket. If you want to travel the state and you want legislators that are peers, that's actually a citizen legislator that we ask for, this is the only way you're going to get it, because you have shut out virtually anybody that's lower income from being able to serve, because they're going to spend all of their money covering their expenses. And I don't think anyone out there can argue that you can eat 2 meals a day, more or less 3, and stay at a motel for $109. That includes during session down here. It just does not match. And a good part of them, I can tell you, I recently went to Jackson, and it was good for about $400 out of your pocket on the thing for a day and a half deal. So I think it's for real. I know there's going to be people upset about what it costs and to perceive it as a salary, but per diem, specifically per federal rules, is not salary. It is it's a compensation, and it's normal under federal rules and laws to compensate out of it. Employees can do it. It's not a salary.
Thank you. Further discussion? Go ahead, Senator.
Just tacking on one additional point, as we're contemplating citizens legislatures, and I agree with the points that were just made, Childcare is another thing that we don't care about, we don't talk about, we don't really raise as an issue, but it does make a difference. And I end up spending an awful lot of my per diem realistically covering costs of childcare, because if I'm in a meeting and Heather's working, that means that we're probably hiring somebody to look after our kids. And I know that that's not something that affects everybody, but if we want a legislature, a citizens legislature that is embracing and open to all in Wyoming, and we want people that have families to be able to come here, it's pretty darn expensive to be a legislator. I don't ever feel like I've really come out ahead on any given day. I feel like every day from a financial standpoint is falling further behind when I'm serving in the legislature, and to try and at least mitigate some of that effect, negative consequence that being a legislator has on the costs associated with just living. This is a rational step in the right direction to the extent that we're just mirroring what GSA has as a standard. I think is a step in the right direction, albeit not necessarily a solution.
Thank you. Further discussion?
Yeah, Mr. President?
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, because I pushed for this for a couple of years, and it's a good time for me to comment on it because it's not going to affect me at all. First of all, I want to say I'm very happy that Senator Rothfuss makes sure he's got good supervision for his children. I think that's important. But second of all, for the committee to be aware of, Representative Gray's comments regarding the Cheyenne legislators is where this has gotten hung up the last two times. And I think for this group, and I guess there'll be a new management council moving forward, but we need to be aware that that has been, the death knell of this discussion in the prior two times, and something to be aware of and consider. May not require action today, but the concept of limiting the amount to the Cheyenne legislators to where it is today, or a percentage, is something that needs to be considered.
Thank you. We had Vice President.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and just to reiterate a little history to take off where Senator Greer, they actually passed this out of the legislature a couple of years ago, and it was vetoed. And it was vetoed based on the issue of this disparity of Cheyenne. We tried to address that, and I think the veto was, in retrospect, was probably accurate in the rationale behind it, because it says, well, what about when we have committee meetings in Casper? And those committee members are still getting full per diem when there's a committee meeting and they're staying at home. So it's a little further than that, but I understand the perception that when you live in a community, say Cheyenne, that during the session are getting full per diem, or you live in one of the larger cities where we have a lot of legislative meetings, and you're getting full per diem at your home. But the converse of that are those people that don't live in communities, that never have a legislative committee. In 12 years, I'm not aware of one in Bags. And so we are paying those motel rooms and those restaurants every single time. There is no additional money associated with that. So on those scenarios where you have meetings in Casper, you're in the same scenario as the people in Cheyenne. For the rest of those in Wyoming that doesn't have meetings, we're paying that full cost out of our pocket every single time. So there is maybe not any parity. I agree with Representative Greer. We may want to look at some equalization, but if we're going to equalize that, you also have to bring in those committee members and the community in which that's the reason we lost that the last time.
Okay, and let's take one more, and then we're going to wrap it up here because we have Senator Case waiting in the periphery out there. Go ahead. Let's go right here. I had a hand, and then.
Mine's just a point of clarification. Mr. Chairman, Matt, I believe they don't get full in committee meetings. You don't get full per diem regardless under our rules. Is that correct? I was thinking if you lived there, you only got a portion of the per diem under our rules. I only wanted clarification to make sure.
Okay, really quick.
Things here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the way it works now, and it was changed, it used to be 25% was in rule, and then during COVID, they put a checkbox on the form on whether you are going to waive per diem or take a half or take a quarter, I think are all possibilities. I have always waived for Casper meetings. I have actually always waived when I don't stay at a hotel room the night before, because that's the principal piece of what per diem covers in the triad, which is lodging, food, and then incidentals. You know, I think the answer here is really that we move more to a receipt-based system and have a cap. I mean, and I think that while there is some workload concerns, that you would just submit those receipts on a meeting and during the session, because you have wild disparities here. I mean, you have the Cheyenne situation where you're getting over now approaching $160 a per diem a day when the expenses in that triad are probably 40 to 50 on average, if that. And then, yes, there are other situations, but I would note on the interim, you're also allowed, and I've never utilized this, but you are allowed to submit a receipt for the Jackson situations. It has to be approved by the committee chairman for those situations when there is a regional disparity in the interim. So anyway, I just don't think this is covering all the, it's just too much for all the vicissitudes that we face, and so I'm going to be a no.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's time to take a vote.
Mr. President,
Go ahead.
if I could,
Go ahead.
we've concentrated on the legislator's part of this. This is tied to boards and commissions. This is tied to 400 other people who volunteer their time. They get no salary. No salary. We need to cover their costs to serve on all the boards and commissions that we have asked them to serve. We have established, and then the governor does most of those appointments with the consent of the Senate. So this not only includes the legislature, this includes all those other folks out there who are tied to this per diem rate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Let's take it to vote. Go ahead.
Where are we on are we on a vote on an amendment right now, Mr. President? I just need to
The
clarify.
amendment passed, now we're back on the bill.
Okay, back on the bill. Mr. President, if I could offer an amendment. This is
Okay.
page 2 of the bill, line 8. Strike the word most. And then pluralize rates. So it would read, to the recent standard, and strike standard, I'm sorry. Strike most, strike standard, pluralize rates, add an S. And then on line 10, strike travel, insert locations. So the line 8 through 10 would now read, to the recent per diem rates established by the GSA for locations within Wyoming. So we are acknowledging there may be multiple rates, and we're acknowledging that they are location-based in Wyoming. And I hope that gets to the
Yeah,
3 current
Really
rates that
quick,
we have.
before I do the second, tell me the line, the change on line 10 again.
The change on line 10 is strike travel, insert locations.
Okay, gotcha. We got a second? Moved in second, Summers seconded first. Any discussion? This is on the amendment. Line 8, remove most, change the word rate to rates.
And strike standard, Mr. President.
And strike standards. And on line 10, location within Wyoming. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Amendment passes. We're back on the bill. All right. Question on, just really quick, I'm going to call the question, folks. I have no problems with the constitutionality of it. Understand exactly what we're doing. Probably going to have to do something eventually better with those boards and commissions, but I sense it'll pass. I'm just generally a no in concept on this. So that's where I'm at. Let's call the roll.
Senator Driscoll?
Aye.
Senator Hicks?
Aye.
Senator Nethercott, excused. Senator Rothfuss? Aye. Representative Connolly? Representative Gray? Representative Greer?
Aye.
Representative Summers? Vice Chairman Barlow? Chairman Dockstetter?
No. Announce the count, please.
7 ayes, 2 noes, 1 excused.
Okay, 0228, legislative per diem moves forward. We've got folks in, what do we got left here? Because we got some folks waiting on the next topic.
Mr. President, I guess if the committee wants to take up the legislative officials' compensation or the healthcare one, either one, those 2 bills remaining.
Let's do them quickly, folks. Let's do
So the state officials' compensation has
Yeah.
two components, Mr.
We need to
President?
divide that up. Should we hold that till next meeting? That needs to be divided. Is that possible, Matt?
Do we want to even move it forward to the next meeting? I guess that would be the question.
okay.
Is there interest to move it
Without-
forward or not?
We can do that without a vote. We can just say without objection, we'll move 0229 state officials compensation to the next meeting.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess if there's not a motion on the bill today, and that's the will of the council, you bet.
There's no
Give
motion,
direction
absent
to me
objection.
to-
That's moving into the December meeting, folks. All right. Next
Easier
one
to
is
talk about.
legislative health care. Okay.
And question to the speaker. This one to me seems that it's important that we continue the discussion on it, but the good speaker said that there was two major elements that need to be changed in regarding dollar figures and how this could actually be operationalized. So I'm curious if we need to move this one along to the next meeting as well in order for that language to be drafted.
Director?
Mr. President, so they're minor adjustments, I would call them. I wouldn't go major. Come on now. But there are a couple of things that we could get some more information on and provide that back to council if they wanted to move this one forward.
What's the committee's desire?
Let's move it
Mr.
along with new
All
information.
right. All right.
Yeah, Mr. President, as they move that along, for me, and I think maybe for other members, the key question is the state paying part of it or is the legislator paying for 100%? I favor the 100% in being able to opt in, but that is a key decision point for me.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, and just maybe for clarification, first to Representative Greer's question. Right now, both of these bill drafts as drafted have the legislator paying the same employee portion as of whatever plan they opt into as any other employee of the state. They don't pay the full contribution. So that would need to be amended in. And I guess my second point is it would help me if we only moved one of these bills forward to the next meeting, then I can make the changes just to that one draft. And probably the better one is Representative Barlow's 316, mainly because it's easier, it'll be easier for EGI to administer. And a key distinction between these two bill drafts is 227 provides for the option for a legislator to participate after their term is over as a retiree, where 316 doesn't. And that really changes the whole retiree concept, mainly because the way it's built into EGI right now, you're only can participate as a retiree if you've paid into the WRS system as a retiree, which legislators don't. So that would be one ask of staff, is to move either 227 or 316.
Committee,
forward.
absent objection, we're just gonna let 227 go by the wayside. We're gonna take the Barlow bill, legislative healthcare 20316, and move it forward to the December meeting. No objection. That's where we're at. That does it all, right? No, Senator Case is up next. He's got okay. That's it with those bills.
Thank you very much.
Senator Case, Chairman Case, thank you for your patience. We'll now move to report from Select Committee on Legislative Facilities, Technology, and Process. Senator Case heading that up along with Representatives Wanitzer and Director Obrecht. Senator Case, welcome to the meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I think my co-chairman is going to try to join us. He hasn't been able to do it yet. Your Select Committee on Facilities, Technology, and Process met on October 12th. We had a half-day meeting in the afternoon. It was a very good meeting, and we came out with 3 recommendations with respect to policies to the Management Council. The first recommendation was with respect to the opportunity for legislators to buy back their laptops as they depart the legislature. We set prices for those. They're slightly under the market, but by the time this all happens, they'll probably be decent prices. Very reflective of a good opportunity. We spent a lot of time talking about that. We also had 2 other motions about kind of the rules process. The first of these motions was with regard to ethics complaints, and really the feeling that we need to look at that section that's in Joint Rule 22.1, and that we need to embark on a long-term look into the ethics complaint process and the tools that we have in that joint rule. And I know the Director Olbrich will be talking more about that after I'm done. Also, we looked closely at the embodiment of all of the management council policies that have occurred and the collection of those policies. And we make a strong suggestion that the legislature adopt those policies in our rules. And the reason for doing that, I think the biggest one is that those policies look like rules. Many of them do, most of them do. And if we were to have it be part of our taking on our joint rules, adding those policies to those, that it would provide the necessary buy-in from the members of the legislature, and we kind of all be on the same page. So those were the three motions, Mr. Chairman. It was a very good meeting. And let me just commend our staff. Our staff has been very active in the tech area. A particular note is the wayfaring system, and Mr. Schwab has been through to NCSL, to the tech committee. He's got kudos for the work that he's done on our wayfaring system. Ms. Mattson also has been very involved in that system, its development, and how it would be used in the future, and how the thinking is shifting away from the wayfaring system being a legislative tool to being really a state capital tool or a government tool. Really commend their work. I also commend their work on the new voting input system, and that they've kind of had the dry run working in the background for the past year or more, and they're ready to bring that to fruition. This has all been done in-house by Mr. Jamie and his crew, and it's just really some amazing accomplishments. We also spent quite a bit of the meeting hearing about complaints about things like Zoom. We have a problem sometimes when a witness testifies in Zoom, for example, and they're recognized, they go through the process, they get recognized, and then they finish with their testimony, and unbeknownst to anybody, they're ushered out of the room, the Zoom room, and yet they may want to testify on a subsequent issue. And we've had instances where members of our citizenry have been locked out from coming back in to testify. We're looking for a fix to that. We're talking about, a little bit better ways to do that. There's also some confusion, and Senator Steinmetz pointed this out about sometimes directions and links come to people in different ways. And there were a lot of little tech issues that we talked about. I'm not sure that you all want to hear about all those, but those are certainly the major ones, and the three motions we hope you'll consider sincerely. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know that we have staff here, especially Director Olbrich, to talk about Rule 22.1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case, I believe it's on the agenda for later. We are going to discuss 22.1, I think.
Great.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to answer any questions at this point.
Mr. Chairman, so three separate items here that this select committee forwarded to council. First is, in your packet of materials, is a memo from Jamie Schaub, LSO IT manager, to the select committee on facilities, tech, and process with the buyback prices for different models of computers for members of the 66th legislature. As Chairman Case described, the select committee adopted these prices. Those prices will then be in effect for any members who want to purchase their laptop that is that are leaving the legislature or getting a new laptop this year under our policy. No action required from council on that. The next two items are first is a consideration of Joint Rule 22-1, which is the process when a complaint for legislative misconduct is filed against a member. And Mr. Chairman, what council could consider here, and this was the recommendation of the Select Committee, is to appoint a subcommittee or another group of legislators to consider possible revisions to this joint rule. Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that whatever the change would be ready for introduction at the beginning of the 67th legislature. This would take at least a year to consider what changes may be necessary to this rule. And Mr. Chairman, I testified before the Select Committee on this. I've been involved now in a few ethics complaints. The rule provides a clear structure on how to handle a complaint. But, Mr. Chairman, not to take up too much of council's time, but it may be that it provides too much structure and takes too much discretion away from the presiding officers and how to handle complaints, what complaints can be handled under this rule. And so my suggestion that was then adopted by the Select Committee would be to form a group to look at that and present changes, if any were warranted, to this rule for adoption by both bodies.
I'd like to have a better understanding of who does the appointments and so forth. Let's come back to the committee. This is under 22 ethics complaints, 22-1. Any further discussion from the body? Further discussion? Go ahead, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. So my understanding is this going to continue to be talked about, adjusted? Next legislature will adopt this or not. I can say with confidence that as someone who had to try to apply this rule, there are many challenges within it because it was written for a single circumstance. And we go back 12 years, you would know what that circumstances was. I think it had to do with equine equids and how they're disposed of in our state, and a particular legislator, et cetera. So it was designed for one purpose, and now because our complaint process and because of some of the things that are occurring, it is very difficult to apply it, and it is exceptionally difficult to apply it when you're not in session. When you're not in session, because we don't have an avenue to actually take the actions necessary. I'm sure my Senate colleagues that have been involved in this would agree. So I do think it needs to continue to be reviewed, continue to be looked at, because we do have a constitutional authority and ability to address matters within our own bodies. It's with our own bodies, too. We're not talking about doing something on behalf of the Senate and the House, et cetera, but within our own bodies. And so it does need to continue to be considered. There are some things that would certainly make a difference, and I look forward to the next legislature taking those up. Thank you.
So, Director, to do this, we move it forward, how do we put it back in the hands of the full legislature? I'm trying to decide what we're doing here.
Mr. Chairman, and, for the sake of time, I opted for brevity here before council on this, but this is a major issue. And it requires a considerable amount of consideration by the membership on how they want to handle their internal policing.
Director, does rules prep it for that, or where does it go to?
You bet.
Management?
Mr. Chairman, what I would suggest is a motion where you and Speaker Barlow appoint members of a subcommittee to take testimony on this issue and report to the Management Council of the 67th Legislature, their findings and potential amendments to Joint Rule 22-1.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion, then I'd entertain a motion regarding that, appointing the Speaker and the President to appoint a subcommittee to prep this material for consideration. Moved, seconded?
Second.
Moved and seconded by the Vice President. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Moving forward. Does take a deeper dive, folks. Let's get it done. We are,
Mr. Chairman, just one other issue.
okay,
That the Select Committee wanted forwarded before Management Council. And this really is another issue I brought up to the Select Committee. And this was an issue that Dave Groover, when he was working through these changes to the Management Council, or to the Wyoming Manual of Legislative Procedure, as you are all well aware, we have got many handbooks, policies, and manuals as a legislature. And my belief is what happened was that issues would come up on, your predecessor councils, and they would create something, a committee, a chairman's handbook, travel regulations, Management Council handbook, or various policies. Well, because you're in such a part-time nature, the Wyoming legislature is, many of the issues that are handled through Management Council actually deal with relations during the session. Like, just by way of example, recently you've amended your dress code for the session. We also have dealt with decorum in the galleries during session, all handled through Management Council policy. Well, really what that should be, those things that are session-oriented or control how actions happen in one of the bodies, should be adopted by the body itself and not through Management Council action. You really are, your statutory directives are to manage LSO staff and to manage the legislative activities during the interim, but not during session. So our idea was to take a 2-year look at those Management Council policies or those different handbooks and manuals of the legislature that deal with session actions, and to put those within the Manual of Legislative Procedure. And so again, appointment of some sort of committee by you two to do that, take a 2-year look at that for an update to the Manual of Legislative Procedure, then for the 68th legislature, not for the 67th to consider.
that's adequate time to do it. Thank you. Anybody have any questions regarding that matter? Let's come back to, we just had one of our co-chairs join us. Chairman Zwanitz, do you want to add anything? We did take a vote, but you may have heard that. But we want to make sure that our chair has some time to talk about it, if you'd like, sir.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I heard Director Obrecht and my colleague, and I have nothing further to add, but I appreciate you taking on all of the issues from facility tech process. It's appreciated.
Thank you and your co-chair for working on this, and looks like we're ready to go with the right equipment, and we have some more work to do down the road as well. Thank you to the co-chairs, Co-Chair Case and Co-Chair Zwanitzer. All right, folks, at this point, we're about 5 minutes behind. Let's go ahead, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think the director was asking if we wanted to take some action on this, and I'm just going to actually weigh in and say I would actually forward this to the succeeding Management Council. They take it up instead of us starting with a committee that then gets rearranged. I think the Joint Rule 22-1, I do want us to have something for them to be presented to them, because that is something, but I think the second component, and maybe Mr. Obrecht disagrees, but I think that's a matter for if it's 2-year term, let's start with the folks that are going to have 2 years at the job, at the wheel, instead of 2 months.
Right. and
Thank
we-
you, Mr. President.
Yeah, and correct, and we acknowledge that. In absent objection, that's what we'll do. Any further discussion on it? I don't think it requires a motion, so. All right. Let's take a 15-minute lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock, program evaluation, function review with Director Obrecht, Willie Sharp, and, okay, 15 after. Okay. We'll come back then at 12:15. We'll come back with program evaluation, function review.
1:15.
1:15.
And we'll actually come back, Mr. Chairman, with the session calendar, revised session calendar for adoption.
Right.
We've got that.
Okay. 1:15, folks.